Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're going to venture into the warm, sun-drenched, and altogether treacherous world of Renaissance Italy. We're going to spend some time with a family whose name has become a kind of shorthand for ambition, scandal, and a certain ruthless flair for getting ahead. A family that for a brief dazzling moment held the keys to the most powerful institution on earth. We're going to talk about the Borgias. Now their story is one of incredible resilience, of staggering grit, and a kind of ingenuity that you almost have to admire, even when it's directed towards some, let's say, morally ambiguous goals. It's a story of outsiders who kicked down the door to the most exclusive club in the world, and then tried to change all the locks. As always, if you enjoy what we do here, and only if it helps you unwind, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. It lets me know that these little journeys into the past are finding a home, and I'm always curious to know where you're listening from tonight. It's a nice thought, all of us scattered around the globe, settling in together for a quiet story. But that's enough of that. The important part is about to begin, so find your spot, dim the lights, adjust your pillow just so, maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, let the sounds of your day fade away. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, just rest. Let your breathing slow down, and let's ease into our journey together, back to a time of silk and steel, of prayer and poison. Chapter 1. The Spanish Outsiders, the genesis of a dynasty. Before the name Borgia sent a little shiver down the spines of popes and princes, before it was whispered in the same breath as poison rings and political assassinations, it was simply Borgia, a family name from a sun-baked corner of Spain, in the kingdom of Valencia, and to the glittering, ancient and deeply snobbish families of Italy, that might as well have been the moon. You have to understand, the Italy of the 15th century wasn't a unified country. It was a chaotic, brilliant and violent patchwork of city-states, papal territories and kingdoms, all jockeying for position. It was a place where your family name was your brand, your history, and your calling card all in one. The great families of Rome, the Orsini, the Colonna, could trace their lineage back through centuries of popes, warlords and senators. They felt they owned Rome, and in many ways they did. Their feuds were the city's weather patterns. Their alliances were the tectonic plates on which everyone else lived. They were the insiders, the old money, the establishment. And into this viper's nest of legacy and entitlement came the Borgias. They weren't grand dukes or legendary warriors. They were what you might call minor gentry, landowners certainly, with a respectable local standing in their hometown of Carfida. But on the grand chessboard of European power, they were barely a pawn. They were, to use the deeply unflattering term the Italians would later spit at them, Catalani, Catalans, a catch-all phrase for anyone from the Iberian Peninsula, dripping with the condescension that only centuries of perceived cultural superiority can produce. They were seen as provincial, uncouth, and most unforgivably of all, foreign. The story of their ascent, the story of how this provincial Spanish family came to dominate the very heart of Christendom, begins not with a warrior or a banker, but with a quiet, ferociously intelligent man of the cloth, a man named Alonso de Borja. Born in 1378, Alonso was not a man who seemed destined to shake the world. He was, by all accounts, studious, disciplined, and profoundly gifted in the labyrinthine world of canon law. Think of canon law as the impossibly complex legal and regulatory framework that governed the entire Catholic Church. It was the operating system for the most powerful multinational corporation in the medieval world, and Alonso was one of its master technicians. He had a brilliant, orderly mind, capable of navigating arguments so dense and obscure they would make most people's eyes glaze over. This was his superpower, not a sword, not a fortune, but a mind that could untangle the knots of power and faith. He spent his early career in the service of the kings of Aragon, a powerful Spanish kingdom. He was a trusted advisor, a diplomat, a university professor. He built a reputation for being shrewd, reliable, and patient, terribly patient. While other men sought glory on the battlefield, Alonso sought leverage in the fine print. He understood that true power often didn't lie in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, painstaking work of negotiation, of drafting treaties, of knowing the rules of the game so well that you could begin to bend them to your will. His big break, the moment that lifted him from a successful regional career onto the world stage, came courtesy of a crisis that was tearing the church apart. It was called the Great Western Schism. For decades, the Catholic world had been in a state of complete chaos, a kind of spiritual civil war. There wasn't one pope, there were two, and for a while even three, all claiming to be the one true successor to St. Peter. It was a public relations nightmare of apocalyptic proportions. Kings and kingdoms took sides. Anathemas were hurled back and forth like rocks, and the average person was left wondering who, exactly, was in charge of their immortal soul. Alonso de Borgia, as a top legal mind in the service of the King of Aragon, one of the last holdouts supporting a renegade antipope, was thrown right into the heart of this mess. His job was to help end it. Through years of careful, delicate, and likely mind-numbingly tedious diplomacy, he helped persuade his king and the last antipope to finally stand down, to abdicate, and to allow the Church to finally reunify under a single pope in Rome. For this service, for helping to heal the single greatest wound in Christendom, a grateful Roman Pope, Martin V, made him a bishop. This was his ticket to the big leagues. It was the moment the name Borgia first appeared on the Italian radar. Alonso was no longer just a Spanish legal scholar. He was now a prince of the Church. He moved to Italy, and this is where the culture shock must have truly begun. Imagine Alonso, a man in his late 60s by the time he's made a cardinal, a man of sober habits, of discipline, of academic rigor, arriving in the glorious, chaotic, and morally flexible city of Rome. Rome in the mid-15th century was a paradox. It was the spiritual heart of Western civilization, a city of breathtaking ancient ruins and sacred basilicas. It was also filthy, dangerous, and run by clans of aristocratic thugs who treated the papacy as their own personal property. The Orsini and the Colonna families and their armies of retainers would regularly turn the city's streets into battlegrounds. They saw the papal states, the territories in central Italy ruled by the Pope, as their private feudal playground. For them, the Pope was not so much a holy father as he was a CEO to be managed, a prize to be won, and they had a very clear idea of who should get the job. One of them, an Italian, preferably a Roman. The idea of some foreign academic, some Catalan, coming in and holding real power was deeply offensive to them. Alonso, now Cardinal Borgia, kept his head down. He lived a simple, almost ascetic life amidst the staggering opulence of the other cardinals. His household was modest. He didn't throw lavish parties. He worked. He continued to be the master administrator, the legal expert, the reliable man you could turn to when a situation required a steady hand and a sharp mind. He became a fixture in the Curia, the central government of the Church. Respected, yes, but also underestimated. He was seen as a useful bureaucrat, a competent foreigner, but certainly not a candidate for the top job. He was old, he wasn't Italian, and he had no powerful family network in Rome to back him up. He was, in short, a non-threat. And that, as it turned out, was his greatest advantage. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V died, and the cardinals gathered in a conclave to elect his successor. This is where the real game was played. The conclave was, and still is, a process shrouded in secrecy, but in the Renaissance it was a hotbed of political horse trading, bribery, and intimidation. The great Roman families, the Colonna and the Orsini, each had their candidates. They pushed, they prodded, they threatened, but they were so fiercely opposed to each other that neither could gain the upper hand. They created a deadlock. The Italian cardinals from other city-states like Venice or Milan had their own agendas and refused to back a Roman. The French cardinals had their own candidate. It was a mess. Days turned into weeks. The smoke from the Sistine Chapel chimney, where they burned the ballots, remained black, signalling no decision had been reached. The city of Rome held its breath. And in these moments of complete gridlock, a new strategy often emerges. The compromise candidate, the caretaker, the placeholder. The cardinals, exhausted and unable to get their own man elected, started looking around for someone uncontroversial, someone old, who likely wouldn't live long enough to cause too much trouble, someone pious and respectable, who wouldn't embarrass the office, and someone without a powerful Italian family, who wouldn't be able to install his own dynasty and lock everyone else out of power. Suddenly, all eyes turned to the quiet, elderly Spanish cardinal, Alonso de Borgia. He ticked all the boxes. He was 77 years old, an astonishing age for the time. He was universally respected for his intellect and piety, and most importantly, he was a foreigner with no real power base in Rome. He was the safe bet, the interim pope. They could elect him, let him reign for a few years while they regrouped, and then, after he passed peacefully, they could get back to the real business of putting one of their own on the throne of St. Peter. It was a spectacular miscalculation. In April of 1455, Alonso de Borgia was elected pope. He took the name Calixtus III, The quiet Spanish academic was now, in theory, the most powerful man in the Western world. The Roman populace and the city's nobility were, to put it mildly, not pleased. They saw him as a barbarian, a gouty old man. The chronicles of the time are filled with snide remarks about his age, his frailty, and his foreignness. They waited for him to be the quiet, unassuming placeholder they had elected. They had completely misunderstood the man. They had mistaken his patience for weakness, and his quiet demeanour for a lack of ambition. Calixtus III might have been old, but he had waited his entire life for this, and he had a fire in him that no one had suspected. He had one overriding, all-consuming passion, a crusade. He was a man of the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to push the Muslim Moors out of Spain. He saw the recent fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 as an existential threat to Christendom. He was determined to launch a massive pan-European holy war to drive the Turks back. Everything else, the petty squabbles of the Roman families, the artistic projects of the Renaissance, the administration of the city was secondary to him, and to achieve his grand objective, he knew he needed people he could trust absolutely. The Italian cardinals who had elected him, he didn't trust them. The Roman nobility, he certainly didn't trust them. They were vipers waiting for him to fail. So, he did what any man in his position would do. He sent for his family. This is the moment the name Borgia truly arrives in Rome, not as a single respected cardinal, but as a clan. And this is the moment that the deep-seated Roman resentment began to curdle into outright hatred. Pope Calixtus III engaged in what we would now call nepotism, on a scale that was breathtaking, even for the time. He needed loyal lieutenants, administrators, and most importantly, muscle, and he found them in his Spanish nephews. The most important of these nephews were the sons of his sister Isabel. Two of them, Pedro Luis de Borgia and Rodrigo de Borgia, were brought to Italy and immediately showered with titles, wealth, and immense power. Pedro Luis, the elder of the two, was the muscle. Calixtus made him captain general of the church, putting him in charge of the papal armies. He was made prefect of Rome, essentially the city's governor. He was given castles, lands, and a fortune. This was an outrage to the Roman aristocracy. The command of the papal army had always been a prize reserved for the sons of great families like the Orsini. Giving it to this 20-something Spanish upstart, was a slap in the face. Pedro Luis was reportedly arrogant and high-handed, which did nothing to endear him to the locals who now had to answer to him. But it was the younger nephew, Rodrigo, who was destined for truly great things. Rodrigo Borgia. When his uncle became pope, Rodrigo was a young university student in his early 20s, studying law at Bologna. He was, by all accounts, brilliant, charming, energetic, and possessed of a bottomless ambition. He was handsome, charismatic, and had an immediate and powerful effect on people, especially women. He was the polar opposite of his grim, ascetic uncle. Where Calixtus was all prayer and legal documents, Rodrigo was all life and action. Calixtus saw the raw talent in his nephew. Within a year of his election, he made both Rodrigo and his brother cardinals. This was a scandal. They were in their mid-20s, had no real ecclesiastical experience, and were known more for their secular pursuits than their piety. To make a young man a cardinal was not unheard of, but to elevate two of your own foreign nephews so quickly, so blatantly, was seen as a naked power grab. The College of Cardinals, that exclusive club of old powerful men, was forced to accept these two young Spaniards into their ranks. The resentment in those hallowed halls must have been thick enough to breathe. Rodrigo, now Cardinal Borgia, was not content to just wear the red hat. He was made Vice-Chancellor of the Holy See. This was not some honorary title. The Vice-Chancellor was effectively the second most powerful, and more importantly, the single most lucrative position in the entire papal government. All of the Church's vast administrative machinery, all the petitions, the appointments, the dispensations, the contracts, and the fees passed through the Vice-Chancellor's office. It was the absolute nerve centre of the Vatican's power and its wealth, and it was now in the hands of a 25-year-old Spaniard, who many saw as little more than a playboy. The Romans now felt they were under occupation. They called it the Catalan invasion. Everywhere they looked, there were Spaniards. Calixtus appointed them to key positions in the Vatican, as castle castellans, as administrators. The sound of Spanish and Catalan dialects now echoed in the corridors of the Apostolic Palace. To the Italians, it felt like a hostile takeover. They saw the Borgias not as legitimate leaders, but as parasites, siphoning off the wealth and power that was rightfully theirs. Imagine the atmosphere in the city, the air thick with suspicion. Every whispered conversation in a Roman dialect could be about you. Every gathering of Italian nobles could be a plot. The Borgias were surrounded by enemies, isolated by their language and their culture. They could only truly rely on each other, and the network of other Spaniards they brought with them. This siege mentality, this sense that it was them against the world, would become a defining characteristic of the Borgia family. It forged them in a crucible of resentment, and it taught them a crucial lesson. In Rome, power was not given, it was taken. And once taken, it had to be defended with absolute ruthlessness, because no one would be there to catch you if you fell. Calixtus III himself cared little for their opinions. He was old, he was focused on his holy war, and his nephews were his tools to achieve it. He poured the Vatican treasury into building a papal fleet. He issued indulgences and taxes to fund the war effort. He did have one notable success. A Christian fleet, funded by him, defeated the Ottomans at the Siege of Belgrade in 1456. The news was a triumph for the aged pope, and he ordered the church bells to be rung every day at noon to commemorate the victory, a tradition that persists in many places to this day. But in Rome, no one cared about Belgrade. They cared about the fact that their city was being run by foreigners. They cared that the prefect of their city, Pedro Luis, was strutting around with an army of Catalan mercenaries. They cared that the vast river of gold flowing into the Vatican's coffers was being controlled by the young, handsome and dangerously competent Rodrigo Borgia. Throughout his uncle's brief reign, Rodrigo learned his trade. He watched the masters of Italian politics at work. He learned how to flatter, how to bribe, how to intimidate. He learned how to play his rivals off against each other. The office of the Vice-Chancellor was the best education in power politics a young man could ever receive. He saw firsthand the greed, the hypocrisy, the ambition that drove the men who wore the robes of faith, and he learned that he was better at this game than almost any of them. He had a natural talent for it. He was a quick study, and while he enjoyed the immense wealth and pleasures his position afforded him, he never lost his focus. He was building his own power base, cultivating his own allies, and making a name for himself that was distinct from his uncle's. The reign of the first Borgia Pope, the old Spanish academic, lasted only 3 years. In the summer of 1458, Calixtus III, now over 80 years old, fell ill and died. The moment the old pope's death became known, Rome exploded. The carefully constructed, but deeply resented edifice of Borgia power came crashing down. The latent hatred of the Roman people and their noble masters for the Catalani was unleashed in a furious wave. The cry went up through the streets, "Death to the Catalans!" Mobs formed, hunting down any Spaniard they could find. Borgia palaces were looted and burned. The Orsini family, who had seethed with resentment for 3 years, saw their chance. They raised their banners and their troops, seeking vengeance and a restoration of their power. Pedro Luis Borgia, the captain general, the man who had been the fist of the Borgia regime, suddenly found himself a man with a title but no army. His Italian mercenaries melted away, unwilling to fight and die for a hated foreigner against the city's true masters. He was forced to flee Rome in disguise, selling off castles for a pittance to the Orsini, just to secure safe passage. He wouldn't make it far. He died of a fever a few months later, a fugitive in a foreign land. The first attempt to establish a Borgia dynasty in Italy had ended in total, abject failure, but one Borgia remained. Rodrigo, the 27-year-old Cardinal Vice-Chancellor, was in the Vatican when his uncle died. He heard the mobs baying for his family's blood. He saw the smoke rising from the looted homes of his countrymen. He was trapped, surrounded by enemies who would have loved nothing more than to see his career, and perhaps his life, come to a bloody end. The Orsini wanted his head. The other cardinals wanted his office. This was the moment that would define him. Lesser men would have fled, just as his brother had. But Rodrigo Borgia was not a lesser man. He stayed. He barricaded himself in the Vatican, used the levers of power he still controlled, and began to negotiate. He played for time. He was a cardinal, after all. And to murder a cardinal during a papal interregnum was a grave step, even for the Orsini. He understood something fundamental about Rome. Its fury was a fire that burned hot, but it could also burn itself out. And he knew that the real power play was not in the streets, but in the upcoming conclave to elect a new pope. While his family's name was being cursed outside the walls, Rodrigo was inside, already cutting deals, forming alliances, and making himself an indispensable player in the election of the next pontiff. He proved that he was not just his uncle's creation, He was a power in his own right. He survived. The storm passed. A new Italian pope was elected, Pius II, and Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, the hated Catalan, not only kept his position as vice-chancellor, but became a key ally and advisor to the new regime. He had looked into the abyss and had not blinked. The genesis of the Borgia dynasty was now complete. The first chapter, the reign of Calixtus III, had taught them everything they needed to know. It had brought them from the provinces of Spain to the centre of the world. It had given them a taste of absolute power, and most importantly, it had shown them the brutal reality of their position. They were outsiders. They would always be outsiders. Their power would never be secure, their legitimacy always questioned. They had no ancient Roman lineage to fall back on, no bedrock of local support. Everything they gained, they would have to fight for, and everything they held, they would have to defend with a ferocity that would shock even the jaded, cynical world of Renaissance Italy. Rodrigo Borgia had learned his lesson well. He would spend the next 3.5 decades as vice-chancellor, patiently, skillfully, and ruthlessly rebuilding his family's fortune and influence, waiting for his own chance at the ultimate prize. He would not make the same mistakes his uncle had. When his time came, he would be ready, the foundation, laid in ambition and cemented in the hostility of a foreign city, was set. The most scandalous and dramatic chapter of the Borgia story was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Keys to the Kingdom. The Making of Pope Alexander VI. And it began, as these things so often do, with a death. On the 25th of July 1492, after a long and rather uninspired reign, Pope Innocent VIII finally succumbed to the illnesses that had plagued him. His passing was not exactly a moment of universal grief in Rome. For the city, the period between a pope's death and the election of a new one, the sede vacante, or empty seat, was a time of terrifying freedom. The rule of law evaporated. The papal guards who kept a fragile order simply melted away. Noble families unleashed their private armies to settle old scores. Shops were looted, and the streets became a chaotic stage for every ambition and grievance. Rome held its breath, simmering in the oppressive August heat, waiting to see who would emerge from the Vatican to claim the throne of St. Peter and, with it, the city itself. Inside the cool stone halls of the Vatican, the atmosphere was just as tense, though far quieter. The princes of the church, the cardinals, began to arrive from across Italy and Europe. These were not humble men of God in the way we might imagine. They were politicians, administrators, warlords and financiers, draped in the crimson of their office. They were the heads of unimaginably wealthy family dynasties, and the papacy was the greatest prize in a game they had been playing their entire lives. And now, after 35 years of patient, meticulous work, Rodrigo Borgia, the Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, felt his moment was at hand. He was 71 years old, but he had the energy and ambition of a man half his age. He was charming, intelligent, and possessed a work ethic that put his rivals to shame. More importantly, he was fantastically, colossally wealthy. Decades as the Church's chief administrator had given him control over a vast network of offices, benefices, and income streams. He had quietly become one of the richest men in Europe, and he understood something fundamental about the men who were about to be locked away with him. Their piety had a price. The conclave of 1492 was scheduled to begin on the 6th of August. 23 cardinals would be walled into the Vatican, specifically within the Apostolic Palace and the newly gloriously decorated Sistine Chapel, until they produced a new pope. Let's just pause on that for a moment. Forget a stuffy corporate retreat. These men were literally bricked in. Masons would come and seal the doors, leaving only a small rotating hatch through which meagre meals could be passed. The longer they took to decide, the more restricted their diet would become, an old rule designed to, shall we say, motivate a decision. It was hot, it was cramped, and it was going to be a masterclass in political manoeuvring. Before they were even sealed inside, the campaigning, the lobbying, the promises had reached a fever pitch. Think of it as the most high-stakes job interview in the world, where the candidates are trying to bribe the hiring committee, and the hiring committee are also the other candidates. It's a beautifully complicated mess. Now we need to meet the main players on this board, the men who held the fate of the church in their hands. First, of course, is our man, Rodrigo Borgia. He was the Spanish outsider, the Catalan, a fact his Italian rivals never let him forget. But he was also the most experienced administrator in the room. He knew the inner workings of the Vatican bureaucracy better than anyone. He was the dean of the College of Cardinals, the man who was in effect running the show until a new pope was chosen. He had 5 children, a fact that was an open secret and, remarkably, not a deal-breaker in the Renaissance church. It simply marked him as a man of the world. His pitch was subtle. He was old. He argued quietly to the younger cardinals. He wouldn't last long. A vote for him was a vote for a short, stable, transitional papacy, during which everyone could enrich themselves and prepare for the next conclave. It was a clever, reassuring lie. His primary rival, his nemesis, was Giuliano della Rovere. If Borgia was smooth, diplomatic and pragmatic, della Rovere was a volcano. He was fiery, impatient, and carried himself with an air of moral superiority. He was a nephew of a former pope, Sixtus IV, and he saw the papacy as his birthright. He despised Borgia, seeing him as a corrupt foreign interloper. Della Rovere's campaign was based on a platform of reform and a return to purity, which was a tough sell to a room full of men who were anything but pure. He didn't have Borgia's liquid cash, so he couldn't buy votes with sacks of gold. Instead, his currency was intimidation and alliances. He was backed by the King of France and the Republic of Genoa, and he wasn't afraid to remind everyone of the powerful friends and armies he had waiting just outside Rome. And then there was the kingmaker, the man in the middle, Ascanio Sforza. He was the younger brother of the Duke of Milan, one of the most powerful men in Italy. Sforza was clever, calculating, and deeply ambitious. He was too young to be a serious papal candidate himself, but he controlled a crucial block of votes. Whichever way Ascanio Sforza decided to go, so would go the papacy. He entered the conclave, ostensibly supporting another candidate, but everyone knew his loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. He and Borgia were rivals, but they were practical men. They understood each other. So the stage is set. The 23 cardinals process into the Sistine Chapel. The frescoes of Botticelli, Perugino, and Ghirlandaio look down on them. Michelangelo's ceiling is still a decade away. For now, the ceiling above them is a simple blue field dotted with golden stars. The doors are sealed, the chants begin, and the games commence. The rules of the conclave are simple in theory, maddening in practice. A candidate needs a 2/3 majority to win. That meant, in this case, 16 votes. Each morning and each evening, there would be a vote, a scrutiny. The cardinals would write their chosen name on a piece of paper, disguise their handwriting, fold it, seal it, and one by one place it in a large chalice on the altar. The ballots would be read aloud, and the totals tallied. If no one reached 16 votes, the ballots would be burned with damp straw, sending black smoke billowing from a chimney over the Vatican, a signal to the tense crowds in St. Peter's Square that no decision had been made. The first scrutiny took place on August 8th. The results showed a dead heat, a handful of votes for della Rovere, a handful for another favoured Italian candidate, and a handful for Borgia. No one was even close to the required 16. It was a perfect stalemate. The cardinals were divided into factions, each unwilling to budge, each hoping the others would crack first under the pressure, the heat, and the increasingly bland diet. This is where Rodrigo Borgia's genius truly came to life. While della Rovere was fuming, trying to bully his colleagues into submission, Borgia was moving through the shadows of the apostolic palace, with the quiet confidence of a master chess player. He didn't waste his time on della Rovere's staunchest supporters. He knew they were a lost cause. Instead, he focused on the undecided, the greedy and the pragmatic. He approached them not with grand speeches about the future of Christendom, but with a ledger. He spoke to them in the language they understood best, power and money. To one cardinal, he might offer a wealthy abbey in Spain. To another, a fortified town from his personal lands. To a third, a prestigious and lucrative bishopric for a nephew. He wasn't just offering cash, he was offering long-term security, career advancement, and dynasty-building opportunities. Compared to della Rovere's angry tirades, Borgia's proposals were a calm, rational, and incredibly tempting business proposition. We can imagine the scenes: a quiet corner of a dimly lit hall, the air thick with the smell of incense and unwashed bodies. Borgia, his face calm and reassuring, leaning in to whisper to a wavering cardinal, "The bishopric of Cartagena. It brings in 10,000 ducats a year. Your nephew is a bright boy. He deserves such a post, don't you think?" There was no shouting, no threats, just the gentle, seductive logic of mutual self-interest. Day after day, the black smoke rose from the chimney. The votes were held, and the deadlock continued. But with each passing scrutiny, Borgia's tally was creeping up. 7 votes, then 8, then 9. He was slowly, painstakingly, picking off his rival's supporters one by one. Della Rovere grew more and more frantic. He knew what was happening. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. He railed against simony, the sin of buying church office, accusing Borgia of trying to buy the Holy Spirit itself. But his cries of outrage sounded increasingly desperate to men who were secretly calculating the value of Borgia's offers. The entire conclave came down to one man, Ascanio Sforza. Sforza had held his block of votes firm, watching the two titans, Borgia and Della Rovere, wear each other down. He was waiting for the perfect moment to sell his support for the highest possible price. Della Rovere couldn't offer him much. The best he could promise was a vague position of influence, something Sforza already had. Borgia, however, could offer him the world, in a final secret negotiation, likely held in the dead of night in a secluded chamber. Borgia made Sforza an offer he could not refuse. It was the masterstroke. He didn't just offer him more money or more land, he offered him his own job. Rodrigo Borgia promised that if Ascanio Sforza delivered the necessary votes, he, Borgia, upon becoming pope, would vacate the office of vice-chancellor, the second most powerful and lucrative position in the entire church, and give it to Sforza. For Ascanio, this was everything. It wasn't just a bribe, it was a promotion to the absolute heart of power. It would make him the new administrative master of the Vatican. It was a deal that would secure the Sforza family's influence for a generation, and according to the chroniclers of the time, the deal was sweetened with a little something extra: 4 mule loads of silver, sent from Borgia's palace to Sforza's as a... The decision was made. Sforza, the great kingmaker, had chosen his king. On the night of August 10th, the word spread like wildfire through the sealed quarters. Sforza had flipped. He was now whipping votes for Borgia. The remaining cardinals, seeing the inevitable, scrambled to get on the winning side, hoping to snatch some last-minute favour before the doors were unsealed. It was a domino rally of ambition. The morning scrutiny on August 11th was a mere formality. One by one, the cardinals placed their ballots into the chalice. The air in the Sistine Chapel was electric. As the names were read out, the count for Borgia rose steadily. 13, 14, 15, and then the 16th vote was read. Rodrigo Borgia. He had done it. He had the 2/3 majority. According to the Master of Ceremonies, Johann Burchard, who kept a meticulous diary of the event, the moment his victory was confirmed, the canopy above Borgia's seat, which had been rigged to fall, accidentally collapsed on him, a slightly comical, undignified start to his reign. But Borgia was unfazed. He was asked the traditional question, "Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff?" His reply was swift and certain, "I accept. By what name do you wish to be called?" He chose Alexander VI, a name that consciously echoed Alexander the Great. It was not the choice of a humble servant of God. It was the choice of a conqueror, a man who intended to command. The ballots were burned, this time with dry straw, and from the small chimney, a plume of white smoke finally curled into the blue Roman sky. Down in the square, the crowd, which had been waiting for days, erupted. A great roar went up. "Habemus, Papam, we have a pope." Inside, the cardinals, even those who had bitterly opposed him just hours before, rushed forward to perform the first adoration, kissing the new pope's feet. Giuliano della Rovere, his face a mask of thunderous fury, refused. He remained in his seat, simmering with a hatred that would define his relationship with Borgia for the next decade. He saw this not as an election, but as a monstrous sacrilege, a stain on the church that he would dedicate his life to erasing. But for now, he was powerless. Rodrigo Borgia, the boy from a minor noble family in Valencia, had outmaneuvered them all. He had used his vast fortune, his political acumen, and his deep understanding of human nature to capture the most powerful office in the Western world. A window was opened, and the senior cardinal deacon stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the sea of people in St. Peter's Square. He announced the news to the city and the world. Rodrigo Borgia of Spain had been elected pope and had taken the name Alexander VI. The days that followed were not ones of solemn prayer and contemplation. They were a celebration, a triumph. Alexander VI's coronation was one of the most magnificent and costly spectacles Rome had ever seen. Triumphal arches were erected, decorated with slogans that bordered on blasphemous. One read, "Rome was great under Caesar, now greater under Alexander. The first was a man, the second is a god." He paraded through the city on a snow-white horse, beaming at the crowds, showered with flowers. It was less a religious procession and more a conqueror's victory march. He was making a statement. This would not be a quiet, unassuming papacy. The age of Borgia had begun, not with a whisper, but with a roar of gold, power, and unapologetic ambition. The foundation he had so patiently laid for 35 years had now become a throne, and from this throne, he, his family, and his children would proceed to write a chapter of history so lurid, so dramatic, and so steeped in scandal that it would echo for centuries to come. The keys to the kingdom were firmly in his grasp, and he had every intention of unlocking any door he pleased. Chapter 3. The Borgia Pope, Sacred Power and Secular Ambition. The keys to the kingdom were, indeed, his, and you can imagine Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, holding them in his mind's eye, not the heavy, ornate keys of St. Peter, symbols of spiritual authority, but a far more practical set, a master keyring, really, for every treasury, every fortress, every alliance, and every back door in Italy. The 35-year climb was over. He had reached the summit, and the view was absolutely spectacular. It was a view cluttered with opportunities. The immediate aftermath of a papal election, especially one as robustly negotiated as this one, wasn't a time for quiet contemplation. It was a time for fulfillment of contracts. It was the political equivalent of everyone coming around to the winner's office, the morning after a corporate takeover, holding out their hands and saying, "All right, let's talk about my new corner office." And Alexander, a man who understood the mechanics of reciprocity better than anyone, was more than happy to oblige. He wasn't just Pope, he was the new CEO, and it was time to distribute the bonuses. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, the man who had been the kingmaker, the floor manager of the conclave, was rewarded so lavishly it bordered on the comical. He was made vice-chancellor, the second most powerful and certainly the most lucrative position in the Curia. It was a fire hose of money and influence aimed directly at him. He was also given Rodrigo's own sprawling, magnificent palace, the Palazzo Borgia, complete with all its priceless furniture, art and tapestries. It was less a gift and more a transfer of ownership, as if Alexander was simply handing over the keys to his old life and saying, "Here, you run this for me now. I have bigger things to attend to." Other cardinals received bishoprics, abbeys, castles, and sacks of gold. Promises made in the hushed shadows of the conclave were now brought into the light and honoured with ink and wax seals. It was a demonstration of a crucial principle for the new Borgia regime. Loyalty, or at least timely cooperation, would be extravagantly rewarded. It sent a clear message to everyone in Rome: this pope pays his debts. And then came the coronation. On a sweltering August day in 1492, Rome put on a show. The city, which had been a hotbed of riot and chaos during the interregnum, was now transformed into a stage for the glorification of its new master. This was not a humble ceremony for a servant of God. This was a Roman triumph, a spectacle designed to awe and intimidate. The procession snaked through the city streets, which had been decorated with triumphal arches, tapestries hanging from every window, and fountains literally flowing with wine. It was a PR campaign of the highest order. Alexander himself, at 61, was still a figure of immense presence. He was tall, powerfully built, with a commanding gaze and a charisma that could charm a bird from a tree or a vote from a wavering cardinal. He rode a magnificent white horse, looking less like a priest and more like an emperor. The papal tiara, the triple crown, was placed on his head, a jewel-encrusted beehive of gold weighing more than a small child, symbolizing his authority over heaven, earth, and the underworld. For a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the acquisition of power, this must have been a moment of profound, almost dizzying satisfaction. He had done it. He, a Spaniard, an outsider from a family that many of the old Roman nobility still viewed as upstarts, was now the vicar of Christ, the successor to St. Peter, the supreme pontiff of the universal church. But even in the midst of this sacred pageantry, the secular ambition was impossible to hide. One of the triumphal arches erected for the day bore a particularly telling inscription, a line that seemed to capture the entire Borgia ethos in a few Latin words. It read, "Caesar was a man, now he is a god. Rome has made the one a Newman, the other a pope." It was a stunningly bold comparison, equating Alexander's rise to the papacy with the deification of Julius Caesar. It was a statement that this was not just a spiritual succession, but the dawn of a new imperial age, and at the heart of that empire was not the abstract concept of the church, but the very real, very ambitious Borgia family. Because for Alexander, the papacy was never the end goal. It was the means to an end. It was the ultimate family business, the greatest franchise opportunity in the history of the world, and he was now the sole proprietor. And like any good family patriarch who suddenly acquires a vast fortune, his first thoughts turned to his children, his beloved, complicated, fiercely ambitious children. They were not to be hidden away or discreetly provided for, as the children of previous popes had often been. No, they were to be the pillars of the new Borgia dynasty. They were his lieutenants, his assets, his most important projects. Let's start with the eldest of the children he had with his longtime mistress, Vannozza di Catane, Cesare. At the time of his father's election, Cesare was a mere 17 years old, and on paper he was already an archbishop. This was, to put it mildly, a bit of a stretch. Cesare had shown approximately zero inclination towards a life of piety. He was brilliant. Yes, he was handsome, cunning, and possessed a chillingly focused ambition that mirrored his father's, but his passions ran towards swords, horses, and the darker arts of political strategy, not towards theology and prayer. You could imagine him sitting through a church service, his mind not on the liturgy, but on calculating the structural weaknesses of the cathedral's walls. Forcing a young man like Cesare into the church was like trying to leash a panther with a string of rosary beads. It was a temporary measure at best, yet for now it was the path his father had chosen for him. The church was the traditional route for a second son, a way to consolidate family power within the institution itself. Immediately after becoming pope, Alexander made Cesare the Archbishop of Valencia, the same position he himself had held for decades. It was a direct inheritance, and then, a year later, in a move that shocked even the jaded sensibilities of the Roman Curia, Alexander elevated his 18-year-old son to the rank of Cardinal. Cardinal Cesare Borgia. The title itself sounds like a contradiction in terms. Here was a young man barely out of his teens, known for his martial prowess, his hot temper, and his conspicuous lack of a spiritual vocation, now a prince of the church. He was meant to be one of the Pope's closest advisors, a pillar of Christendom, a man whose life was dedicated to God. In reality, he was a secular prince trapped in a cardinal's red robes. He wore the vestments, but they fit him like a costume. He moved through the apostolic palace with a restless, caged energy. You can almost picture him, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of a sword that was no longer there, his eyes scanning every political gathering, not for souls to save, but for rivals to crush. His father gave him immense wealth and influence, but he had denied him the one thing he truly craved, a battlefield, an army, a kingdom to conquer. Cesare was a man of action, and he had been placed in a world of ritual and contemplation. It was a gilded cage, and you can be sure that from the moment those red robes were placed on his shoulders, Cesare Borgia began plotting how he was going to break out of it. He saw the power his father wielded, and he wanted his own version of it, not the indirect, spiritual power of a priest, but the direct, tangible power of a soldier and a king. For now he would play the part, but the smouldering resentment and ambition were there for all to see. Then there was the second son, Juan, or Giovanni as the Italians called him. If Cesare was the coiled spring of ambition, Juan was the object of their father's most straightforward hopes. Juan was the handsome one, the charming one, the one who was, by all accounts, Alexander's favourite. He was not as intelligent or as ruthless as Cesare, but he had an easy grace that his elder brother lacked, and for Juan, Alexander had a very different, much more direct path in mind. Juan would be the secular arm of the Borgia family. He would be the great prince, the military commander, the founder of the landed dynasty that would rule for generations. While Cesare was being fitted for cardinal's robes, Juan was being showered with titles and estates. Alexander wasted no time. He used his authority as pope, and his connections as a Spaniard, to have Juan made the Duke of Gandia in Spain, inheriting the family's ancestral lands. This gave him a respectable, noble title. But that was just the beginning. The Pope's real ambition for Juan lay in Italy. Alexander needed a commander for the papal armies, a loyal general who would enforce his will throughout the tumultuous papal states, and who better for the job than his own beloved son? So, Juan was brought to Rome and placed at the head of the Pope's forces. He was given a lavish palace, a massive income, and the title of Gonfalonier, or standard-bearer of the church. It was a position of immense military and symbolic importance. He was, in effect, the Borgia family's enforcer. He was meant to be their Caesar, their great general. The only problem was that Juan, while charming, seemed to possess very little of the military genius or the disciplined grit that such a role required. He enjoyed the uniform more than the battlefield, the parades more than the strategy sessions, He was arrogant, spoiled, and far more interested in the pleasures of Rome than in the hard work of building an empire. This created a simmering, unspoken tension between the brothers that you could cut with a knife. Imagine the family dinners in the Vatican. On one side sits Cesare, the brilliant, dangerous strategist, forced to wear the robes of a priest and discuss theology, his mind churning with plans he cannot execute. On the other side sits Juan, dapper and preening in his general's uniform, talking about his latest military review or his newest horse, holding the very position that Cesare believed should rightfully be his. It was a recipe for fraternal disaster, a domestic drama playing out at the very heart of Christendom, fueled by their father's blatant favoritism. Alexander had, in his attempt to provide for both his sons, inadvertently set them on a collision course. And then there was Lucrezia. If Cesare was the weapon, and Juan was the prince, Lucrezia was the key. She was the ultimate diplomatic tool, the most precious piece on the Borgia chessboard. At the time of her father's election, she was just 12 years old. By the standards of the time, she was rapidly approaching marriageable age, and for a man like Alexander VI, an unmarried daughter of marriageable age was an asset of incalculable value. Her hand in marriage could seal an alliance, pacify a rival, or deliver an army. She was the human embodiment of a political treaty. Alexander and Cesare, for it was Cesare who often had a hand in these cold calculations, surveyed the political landscape of Italy like two master jewelers examining a gemstone. They were looking for the perfect setting for Lucrezia. The Italian peninsula was a viper's nest of shifting alliances and rival city-states. To the north you had the powerful Duchy of Milan, ruled by the ambitious and treacherous Sforza family. To the south, the Kingdom of Naples, a constant source of conflict. In the middle, Florence, the Republic of merchants and artists, and Venice, the serene and powerful maritime empire. The papal states which the Borgias now controlled were right in the centre of it all, a chaotic and often rebellious territory that needed to be tamed. To secure their northern flank, the Borgias needed an alliance with Milan, and the head of the Sforza clan, Ludovico il Moro, had a cousin, Giovanni Sforza, the lord of the small but strategically useful city of Pesaro. He was a widower, in his late 20s, and a man of some military reputation. He was the perfect candidate, and so a deal was struck. The Pope's daughter, Lucrezia, would marry Giovanni Sforza. In return, the Sforza family would be firm allies of the Borgias. The wedding, which took place in the Vatican in 1493, was an affair of staggering opulence. Lucrezia was just 13 years old. Try to picture it. A young girl described by chroniclers as having long golden hair and a graceful beauty, standing at the centre of this magnificent, monstrous machine of power. The ceremony was held in the Apostolic Palace itself, a breach of decorum that signalled to everyone that the Pope's family affairs were now official state business. There were feasts, pageants and theatrical performances that went on for days. The Pope himself presided over the festivities with beaming pride, reportedly laughing and joking with the guests, his delight unconcealed. The dowry was enormous, a fortune in gold that formally bound the two families. But beneath all the silken gold, it was a cold, hard transaction. A 13-year-old girl was being handed over to a man twice her age to secure a military alliance. The stories and rumours that emerged from this wedding feast, many of them likely exaggerated by the Borgias' enemies, painted a picture of a Vatican that had lost all semblance of spiritual decorum. There were tales of lavish banquets that devolved into debauched parties, of behaviour that would have been more at home in the court of a pagan emperor than in the home of the Vicar of Christ. The important thing, however, was the political reality. Lucrezia was now a Sforza. The northern border was, for the moment, secure. Lucrezia, the young, innocent-looking girl, had done her duty. She had played her part. It was the first, but by no means the last, time that her life and her happiness would be sacrificed on the altar of her family's ambition. And let's not forget the youngest son, Geoffrey, who was even younger than Lucrezia. He too was a pawn, just waiting to be moved into position. Alexander already had his eyes on the Kingdom of Naples to the south. He began negotiations to marry Geoffrey, a boy of 12, to Sanchia of Aragon, the illegitimate daughter of the King of Naples. It was the same strategy, played out again: secure a border, gain an ally, and advance the family's power through the marriage of a child. The Borgia children were the ligaments connecting the papacy to the secular powers of Italy, stretching and pulling the family's influence into every corner of the peninsula. This, then, was the family business in action. Alexander sat at the centre of the web, like a masterful spider, pulling the strings. Cesare, the Cardinal, fumed and plotted. Juan, the general, preened and paraded. Lucrezia, the bride, smiled and obeyed. It was a thoroughly secular operation, a family dynasty being constructed using the tools and the treasury of the Holy See. It was breathtaking in its audacity. Yet, at the very same time that Alexander was orchestrating these intricate family maneuvers, he was also required to perform his duties as the spiritual head of 1 billion Christians. This is the central paradox of Rodrigo Borgia, the duality that makes him such a fascinating and confounding figure. He wasn't just a corrupt Italian prince who happened to be pope. He was, in many ways, an incredibly effective and decisive pope who also happened to be a corrupt Italian prince. He could compartmentalize his roles with a skill that was almost superhuman. In the morning, he might be negotiating the finer points of Lucrezia's dowry. In the afternoon, he could be found making a decision that would alter the course of global history. And there is no better example of this than the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's one of those things you might remember vaguely from a history class, a dusty old treaty about ships and maps. But think about what it actually was. In 1493, just a year into his pontificate, news was reaching Europe of the incredible discoveries being made across the Atlantic by a certain Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who had been sailing under the flag of Spain. At the same time, the Portuguese were making their own voyages, pushing down the coast of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. These two Catholic seafaring powers, Spain and Portugal, were on the verge of a global conflict over these new lands and trade routes. They were like two kids who had simultaneously discovered a giant, unclaimed candy store and were about to start throwing punches. They needed an arbitrator, a referee with unimpeachable authority to settle the dispute. And in the 15th century, there was only one person on earth who held that kind of authority, the Pope. So they came to Alexander VI. They came to the man who was busy marrying off his daughter and making his teenage son a cardinal. And they asked him to divide the entire unknown world between them. And Alexander, with a breathtaking sense of his own power, did exactly that. He took out a map, or what passed for a map of the world at the time, a document filled with vast, terrifyingly blank spaces. He listened to the arguments from the Spanish and Portuguese ambassadors, and then he issued a series of papal bulls. In essence, he drew a line down the map of the Atlantic Ocean. He declared that all new lands discovered to the west of this line would belong to Spain, and all new lands to the east of it would belong to Portugal. Later, in the actual Treaty of Tordesillas signed in 1494, that line was moved a bit further west, a crucial adjustment that would inadvertently give Portugal its claim to Brazil. Step back and consider the sheer, unmitigated audacity of this act. A man in a room in Rome with a quill and a piece of parchment drew an imaginary line across a planet whose true dimensions he could barely guess at, and in doing so handed over continents, oceans and millions of undiscovered human souls to two European kingdoms. It was perhaps the single largest real estate transaction in human history. He did it without consulting any of the people who actually lived in these lands, of course. From his perspective, they were simply part of the inventory. Now, was he doing this out of a pure, disinterested desire for peace between two Christian nations? Well, let's be generous and say that was part of the public justification. But Alexander was a Spaniard. The ruling monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, were his patrons. By granting the lion's share of the New World to Spain, he was ensuring the continued loyalty and support of the most powerful nation in Europe. It was a brilliant geopolitical move, a way of solidifying his own position by currying favour with his homeland. It was an act of sacred authority, a pope bringing peace, but it was motivated by the most secular and pragmatic of ambitions. This is the essence of Alexander's pontificate. He could operate on two completely different planes simultaneously. He saw no contradiction between being the supreme arbiter of global destiny and being a doting, if manipulative, father who used his office to enrich his children. To him, it was all part of the same grand project, the security and exaltation of the House of Borgia. The church was the instrument, the family was the cause. Life inside the Vatican reflected this duality perfectly. The apostolic palace, which for centuries had been a place of solemn ritual and quiet administration, was transformed into the court of a vibrant and deeply secular Renaissance prince. Alexander was a man of immense and refined taste. He loved art, music and theatre. He became a great patron of the arts, commissioning frescoes from Pinturicchio to decorate his lavish new private apartments, the Borgia apartments, which you can still visit today. And the scenes he chose to have painted were not just of saints and martyrs. They were a blend of Christian narrative and pagan mythology, a reflection of his own complex worldview. He had himself painted into one of the frescoes, kneeling in prayer, the very image of a pious pontiff. It was masterful branding. The halls of the Vatican, once trod by silent black-robed monks and scribes, now echoed with the laughter of his children, the music of lutes and the rustle of silk gowns. Banquets were a regular occurrence, extravagant affairs with dozens of courses, wine flowing freely, and entertainment that pushed the boundaries of propriety. The Pope's own mistress, the stunningly beautiful Giulia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Giulia la Bella, was a constant and visible presence at court. She was married, of course, to a minor Roman noble, but everyone knew that her power and influence came from her relationship with the Pope. Alexander even had her brother, Alessandro Farnese, made a cardinal, a promotion that earned him the rather unflattering nickname, the Petticoat Cardinal, Schlove. To the outside world, and especially to Alexander's enemies, this was an outrage. The heart of Christendom, they whispered, had become a den of iniquity, a place of open nepotism, simony, and lust. The German monk Savonarola, down in Florence, began to preach fiery sermons, calling Alexander the Antichrist, and predicting that God's wrath would soon fall upon the corrupt Church of Rome. These criticisms, while certainly coloured by political opposition, were not without merit. Alexander's court was scandalous. His methods were corrupt. He perfected the art of simony, the buying and selling of church offices. If a wealthy bishop died, his office would be sold to the highest bidder. Alexander also discovered a wonderfully simple way to raise vast sums of cash whenever he needed it. He would simply create a new batch of cardinals. Each new appointee would be expected to pay a hefty gratitude fee for the honour of receiving the red hat. When he needed money for Juan's armies, or for a dowry for Lucrezia, he would simply hold a consistory, announce a dozen new cardinals, and the treasury would be replenished. It was a fundraising model that was as effective as it was scandalous. Yet, at the same time, if you were an ordinary pilgrim visiting Rome for a Jubilee year, your experience might have been quite different. You would have seen a city being beautified, new streets being built, order being maintained. You would have seen Pope Alexander presiding over Mass in St. Peter's with a gravitas and dignity that was second to none. He was a master of the liturgy, his powerful voice filling the basilica. He was also a tireless administrator. He would wake early, read missives and diplomatic reports, and hold audiences for hours on end. He reformed the Vatican's finances, or at least made them more efficient at funding his projects. He was intelligent, diligent, and possessed an almost superhuman capacity for work. How do we reconcile these two figures, the piously kneeling pontiff in the fresco, and the man who hosted decadent parties, the world-shaping diplomat of Tordesillas, and the father who sold his daughter's hand in marriage? The truth is, to Alexander himself, there was likely no contradiction to reconcile. He came from a world where the lines between sacred and secular were not just blurry, they were often non-existent. A bishop was also a feudal lord. An abbot was also a military commander. The Pope was also a king. Rodrigo Borgia did not see himself as corrupting the papacy. He saw himself as using the tools of the papacy, as they existed in his time, to their absolute fullest potential. Power, in his view, was meant to be used, wealth was meant to be spent, and family was meant to be promoted. He was a product of his age, but he was also its most extreme and unapologetic practitioner. Other popes had had children. Other popes had engaged in nepotism. But no one had ever done it with such openness, such a complete lack of shame. No one had ever so thoroughly tried to fuse the institution of the papacy with the dynastic ambitions of a single family. He wasn't trying to serve the church, he was trying to make the church serve him. And in these early years of his reign, from 1492 to the mid-1490s, it seemed to be working brilliantly. He had secured his power base in Rome. He had neutralized his rivals in the College of Cardinals. He had forged key alliances through the marriages of his children. His son the general was at the head of his army, and his son the cardinal was a powerful voice in the Curia. He had successfully arbitrated a major international dispute, winning the loyalty of the Spanish crown. He was a patron of the arts, a builder, an administrator. On paper it was a stunningly successful record. The Borgia bull, the symbol of his family, was becoming the most feared and respected emblem in all of Italy. But the foundations of this glittering edifice were built on precarious ground. They were built on resentment, jealousy, and fear. The noble families of Rome, like the Orsini and the Colonna, whom he had pushed aside, were just waiting for a moment of weakness. The other Italian states, like Venice and Florence, watched his growing power with deep suspicion. And within his own family, the seeds of future tragedy were already being sown in the rivalry between his sons. The very methods he used to acquire power, the ruthlessness, the bribery, the utter disregard for convention, created a legion of enemies who were eager to see him fall, and who were more than willing to believe and to spread the most monstrous rumours about him and his family. The golden age of Alexander's early pontificate was just that, a gilded surface, and beneath it the pressures were building. The very alliances he had so carefully constructed were by their nature temporary. In the cutthroat world of Renaissance Italy, a treaty was not a sacred pact, it was merely a statement of temporary convenience. The marriage of Lucrezia to Giovanni Sforza had secured the northern border for now, but what would happen when that alliance was no longer convenient? What would happen when a better offer came along? For the Borgias, loyalty was a commodity, and a marriage contract, like any other contract, could be voided if it no longer served its purpose. A storm was coming. A French king with an old claim to the kingdom of Naples was gathering an army, preparing to march down the length of Italy, threatening to shatter the fragile peace that Alexander had so carefully constructed. The cosy world of papal bulls and dynastic marriages was about to collide with the brutal reality of steel and cannon fire. The Borgia Pope had consolidated his power, placed his children on the board, and redrawn the map of the world to his liking. He was the master of his universe, a sun around which his family and the church itself seemed to revolve. But the sky was darkening, and the reign that had begun with such a roar of triumph and gold was about to enter a much darker and more dangerous chapter. The sacred power had been secured, the secular ambition had been set in motion. Now both would be put to the test, and the world would watch to see if the House of Borgia, this audacious, brilliant and scandalous family, would soar to create a permanent dynasty, or if it would simply burn itself out in a spectacular blaze of glory and infamy. The quiet corridors of the Vatican were about to become the epicenter of a political earthquake, and Alexander, serene and confident, believed he was ready for it. He held the keys, after all. He was sure he could lock any door against any threat. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. Chapter 4. Cesare Borgia, the Cardinal, and the Condottiero. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The threat he was preparing for, the one he thought would come from the great powers of Europe or the bitter cardinals in Rome, wasn't something that could be barred by a locked door, because the greatest threat to the stability of his reign, and the most potent engine of his family's ambition, was already inside the house. It slept under his roof, ate at his table, and wore the solemn crimson robes of a prince of the church. The earthquake wasn't coming for the Vatican, it was coming from it, and its name was Cesare. If you were to cast the Borgia family as a play, Lucrezia would be the tragic heroine, Juan the dashing but doomed cavalier, and Rodrigo, Pope Alexander VI, the larger-than-life patriarch pulling all the strings. But Cesare was something else entirely. He was the dark protagonist, the anti-hero, the one character who seemed to have read the script ahead of time and decided to rewrite his part completely. From his very birth, there was a sense that Cesare was a force of nature crammed into a role that was several sizes too small. He was the second son, and in the grand, ruthless calculus of dynastic families, the second son often gets the consolation prize. The first son, in this case, the charming and handsome Juan, Duke of Gandia, was destined for a secular life of command, titles and military glory. He was to be the sword of the family. Cesare, the more intelligent, more intense, and infinitely more dangerous of the two, was handed a different kind of uniform. He was destined for the church. From the age of 7, his path was meticulously laid out. He was given clerical appointments before he was old enough to properly understand what they were. By 17, his father, still a cardinal, had made him a bishop. A year later, when Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI, one of his first acts was to make his teenage son a cardinal of the church. He was now Cardinal Valentino, a title derived from his bishopric in Valencia, Spain. It was a spectacular rise, a testament to his father's power and nepotism. But for Cesare, it must have felt less like a promotion, and more like a beautifully gilded cage. Imagine for a moment the sheer cognitive dissonance of it all. Here was a young man brimming with martial ambition, a skilled horseman, a talented swordsman, with a mind that saw the world as a complex chessboard of power and opportunity, and he was being asked to spend his days in liturgical ceremonies, to debate theology, to take vows of celibacy, and to wear robes that were designed for solemn procession, not for a quick draw of a dagger. It was like trying to leash a panther and teach it to purr on command. The contemporary accounts of Cesare, during his time as a cardinal, are fascinating. They describe a man of fearsome intelligence, of few words, of an almost unnerving self-possession. He was handsome, but in a severe, unsettling way. Where his brother Juan was all easy charm and smiles, Cesare was coiled intensity. He moved through the Vatican with a quiet, predatory grace, his dark eyes missing nothing. He performed his duties as a cardinal with a kind of cold competence, but no one who met him was under any illusion that his heart was in it. His heart was in the clang of steel, the roar of cannon, and the intricate dance of military strategy. He watched his brother Juan be showered with the titles and commands that he himself craved. Juan was made gonfalonier, the commander of the papal armies. It was Juan who was sent out to lead soldiers, to win glory, to be the secular military arm of the Borgia enterprise. And by all accounts, Juan was not particularly good at it. He was vain, impulsive, and lacked his brother's strategic genius. One can only imagine the silent, simmering resentment building in Cardinal Valentino as he sat in consistory meetings, listening to dry ecclesiastical reports, while his less capable brother was out playing soldier, living the life Cesare felt was his by right of talent, if not by birth order. It's the timeless story of the wrong person in the wrong job, a frustration so many of us can understand, though perhaps on a slightly less dramatic scale. It's the frustration of knowing you could do a better job than your boss, but you're stuck in a different department, filing paperwork that feels utterly meaningless. For Cesare, that paperwork just happened to involve the governance of the universal church. This slow-burning fire of ambition needed only a spark to become an inferno, and that spark came on a warm June night in 1497. The story of what happened to Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, is one of those great, murky, unsolved mysteries of the Renaissance, clouded by rumour, propaganda, and the passage of time. What we know for sure is this. Juan attended a dinner party at his mother's villa with Cesare and some other family members. Afterwards, he rode off into the Roman night with a single attendant and a mysterious masked man, telling Cesare he had some private business to attend to. He was never seen alive again. A search was launched. Days later, a fisherman reported seeing a group of men throw a body into the Tiber River. He hadn't reported it at the time, he said, because he saw things like that thrown into the river almost every night. It was just Rome being Rome. The river was dragged, and one's body was recovered. He had been stabbed 9 times. His purse, still full of gold ducats, was untouched. This was not a robbery. This was an assassination. The Pope was shattered. Alexander VI, the man who seemed to control kings and cardinals with effortless guile, was reduced to a broken-hearted father. He locked himself in his chambers, weeping, refusing to eat. For a week the Vatican ground to a halt, paralysed by the Pope's grief. When he finally emerged, he vowed to find the killer and bring them to justice, no matter how powerful they might be. An investigation was launched, and then, just as quickly and just as mysteriously, it was called off. The official inquiry went silent. No one was ever charged. But Rome whispered, and the whispers all seemed to form one name: Cesare. Had he done it? We will never know for certain. There were other suspects, of course. A slighted husband, a rival family like the Orsini. One had made many enemies, but the timing was just too perfect. The one person standing between Cesare and the secular destiny he craved was now gone. The sword of the family had been broken, and there was a sudden urgent need for a new one. It was, to use a modern and rather cold-blooded term, an incredibly convenient corporate restructuring. The position of Chief Military Officer for Borgia Inc. had just opened up, and the most qualified candidate was already on the board of directors. In the aftermath of Juan's death, Cesare played the part of the grieving brother and dutiful son. He comforted his father, he attended the masses, he maintained a sombre and appropriate demeanour, but beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of his life were shifting. The obstacle was gone. The path was clear. Now he just had to do something that had never been done before in the entire history of the Catholic Church. He had to quit. On August 17th, 1498, a little over a year after his brother's death, Cesare Borgia stood before his father and the College of Cardinals and formally requested permission to renounce his holy orders. He wished to lay aside his cardinal's hat and return to the status of a layman. You have to understand how utterly shocking this was. It was unprecedented. The cardinal's was a lifetime appointment. It was a sacred vow, a spiritual marriage to the church. To ask to be released from it was like asking to be surgically removed from the Pope's own body. It simply wasn't done. Caesar argued his case with his typical cold logic. He claimed he had only entered the church to please his father, that his soul was inclined not to contemplation and prayer, but to secular pursuits. It was, in its own way, an honest confession. He was admitting to everyone that the last decade of his life had been a charade, a role he was playing while waiting for his real life to begin. The cardinals were stunned. But Alexander, who had by now recovered from his grief and was once again the master strategist, knew exactly what was happening. This was not a loss, it was a redeployment of his most valuable asset. The family needed a general more than it needed another cardinal. He granted his son's request, and just like that, Cesare Borgia shed his red robes. He walked out of the Vatican not as Cardinal Valentino, but simply as Cesare Borgia, a private citizen. But not for long. This act was the public declaration of his ambition. It was a signal to the world that the game had changed. The Borgias were no longer just playing the game of clerical power. They were now making a bid for temporal hereditary power. They weren't just content to rule from the Vatican for a generation. They wanted to build a kingdom that would last, and Cesare would be its architect and its king. His first move was a masterstroke of diplomacy, orchestrated by his father. Cesare was to travel to France, to the court of the new king, Louis XII. He went bearing gifts. The most important was a papal annulment for the king, allowing him to divorce his wife and marry Anne of Brittany, a move that would secure a critical territory for the French crown. In exchange for this papal favour, Cesare was to receive a French bride, a French title, and most importantly, French military support for his future plans. Sarah's arrival in France was a spectacle of calculated magnificence. He entered the city of Chinon, not as a disgraced ex-cardinal, but as a conquering hero. His procession was designed to awe and intimidate. He was decked out in black velvet, his horse shod in silver, his retinue laden with gold and jewels. It was a public relations campaign of the highest order, designed to erase the memory of the sombre churchman and introduce the world to the new Cesare, the prince, the warrior, the man of action. The French, who valued style and martial prowess, were captivated. The king made him the Duke of Valentinois, a title that cleverly echoed his old cardinal name, Valentino. From this point on, he would often be known as Il Valentino. It was a brilliant piece of personal branding. He was then married to Charlotte d'Albret, the sister of the King of Navarre, a beautiful and well-connected noblewoman. In one fell swoop, Cesare had a new title, a new wife, new and powerful allies, and the promise of a French army to back his ambitions. He had successfully reinvented himself. The transformation was complete. The chrysalis of the cardinal had been cast aside, and the Condottiero, the warlord, had emerged. And now, with the backing of France and the treasury of the papacy at his disposal, Cesare turned his eyes towards his great project, the subjugation of the Romagna. The Romagna was a region in central Italy that was, on paper, part of the Papal States. In reality, it was a chaotic patchwork of dozens of small city-states, each ruled by its own petty tyrant, a collection of families with names like the Malatesta, the Sforza, and the Manfredi. They were known as the vicars of the church, which was a polite way of saying they were supposed to be loyal to the Pope, but in practice did whatever they wanted. They paid their taxes to Rome only when they felt like it, and they ruled their little fiefdoms with absolute and often brutal authority. For centuries, popes had tried and failed to bring this region to heel. It was a viper's nest of intrigue, betrayal, and incessant warfare. This was the land that Cesare Borgia now intended to conquer and forge into a unified, centralized state, a hereditary kingdom for the House of Borgia. It was an ambition of breathtaking scale, and most observers at the time probably thought it was impossible. They had not yet seen Cesare in action. His first campaigns, beginning in 1499, were a revelation. They demonstrated a new kind of warfare, a style that was terrifyingly modern in its efficiency and ruthlessness. The old way of war in Italy, practiced by the traditional condottieri or mercenary captains, was often a slow, stylized, almost theatrical affair. Battles could be relatively bloodless, with armies maneuvering for weeks to gain a slight advantage, and ransoming prisoners being more profitable than killing them. It was a business, and the goal was to keep the business going. Caesar was not interested in that kind of business. He moved with a speed that stunned his opponents. He did not posture, he struck. He used his artillery, the most modern cannons supplied by the French, not just to intimidate, but to obliterate. He would roll his guns up to a city's walls, and begin a relentless systematic bombardment that shattered fortifications that had stood for centuries. He believed in terror as a tool. When he took a city, his retribution against those who had defied him was swift and absolute. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to send a message to the next city on his list. Resistance is futile, and it will cost you everything. One of his first major targets was the city of Forlì, defended by one of the most remarkable women of the Renaissance, Caterina Sforza. She was known as the Tigress of Forlì, a woman as ruthless and formidable as any man of her time. When Cesare's forces surrounded her city, she retreated to the central fortress and dared him to take it. Legend has it that when Cesare's men captured her children and threatened to kill them in front of the walls if she didn't surrender, she lifted her skirts, exposed herself to the besieging army, and shouted that she had the equipment to make more children. Whether the story is true or not, it speaks to her reputation. She was not a woman who would be easily intimidated. But Cesare was not easily deterred. He brought his cannons to bear on her fortress, the Rocca di Ravaldino, and systematically pounded it into rubble. He eventually stormed the keep, captured Caterina, and sent her as a trophy back to Rome. The tigress had been caged. The message was clear. No one, no matter how fierce or famous, could stand in the way of the Duke. He moved from city to city. Imola, Faenza, Pesaro, the petty lords of the Romagna, who had spent their lives scheming against one another, were completely unprepared for this focused, unstoppable force. He was a shark swimming through a pond of minnows. He was also incredibly adept at the political game. He would use diplomacy when it suited him, making promises he had no intention of keeping. He would exploit old rivalries, turning his enemies against each other, and when diplomacy and division failed, he would use poison, the dagger, the rope. For Cesare, the ends always justified the means. The only morality was success. The only sin was failure. What is perhaps most surreal about this period is the presence of Leonardo da Vinci in Cesare's employment. In 1502, the greatest artist and scientist of the age, the man who painted The Last Supper and was dreaming of human flight, was hired by Cesare as his chief military architect and engineer. It's a partnership that almost defies belief. Leonardo, the universal genius, the humanist, travelled with the most feared army in Italy. His notebooks from this time are filled not with sketches of angels, but with precise topographical maps for military campaigns, innovative designs for fortifications, and schematics for new and deadlier war machines. He surveyed the land Cesare conquered, planned canals to divert rivers and flood enemy towns, and applied his peerless intellect to the bloody business of war. It was a meeting of the two most modern minds in Italy, one dedicated to creation, the other to destruction, and for a brief, bizarre period, they worked towards the same goal, the consolidation of Borgia power. As Cesare's new state began to take shape, his own power and reputation grew to mythic proportions. He became the master of the Romagna, feared and, in some quarters, even respected. He brought a kind of brutal order to a land that had known only chaos. He swept away the corrupt old lords and installed his own efficient, centralized administration. He protected common people from the whims of bandits and petty aristocrats. He was a tyrant, yes, but he was a competent tyrant. He made the proverbial trains run on time, even if he had to kill the station master to do it. But his very success created a new problem. The tools of his conquest had been the Condottieri, the mercenary captains who led the various companies of his army, men like Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, and members of the powerful Orsini family. These men were cut from the same cloth as the lords Cesare had just deposed. They were ambitious, treacherous, and loyal only to gold and their own self-interest. As they watched Cesare's star rise, they began to grow fearful. They realized that once Cesare had finished using them to conquer the Romagna, he would almost certainly dispose of them next. A state builder like Cesare had no long-term use for independent contractors with their own private armies. They were a liability. So, in the autumn of 1502, they decided to strike first. They formed a conspiracy, a diet of magicians as it was called, and turned against him. They seized the fortress of Urbino, a key city in his new duchy, and for a moment it looked as though Cesare's spectacular rise was about to come to a sudden and ignominious end. His enemies were united, he was short on troops, and his new state seemed to be crumbling. This was the moment that would define Cesare Borgia's legend. It was the crisis that would reveal the true, terrifying depths of his cunning. Instead of panicking, he played for time. He opened negotiations with the rebellious captains. He feigned weakness and a desire for reconciliation. He was surprisingly generous, offering them better contracts, pardons for their treason, and a renewed sense of partnership. He conceded to their demands, promising them anything and everything they wanted. He was so convincing, so seemingly desperate to have his trusted generals back at his side, that they fell for it. Their own greed and arrogance blinded them. They believed they had outsmarted him, that they had him at their mercy. They reconciled with him and agreed to lead their troops to help him capture the town of Senigallia. And so we come to the last day of 1502, one of the coldest and most infamous nights of the Italian Renaissance. Cesare invited the four main conspirators, Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, and two prominent members of the Orsini clan, to a celebratory dinner in the palace at Senigallia to cement their new agreement. He greeted them at the gates with warmth and friendship, embracing them like long-lost brothers. He was so disarmingly charming that they agreed to dismiss their own troops, who were to camp outside the town, while they went inside for the feast. It was a fatal mistake. They walked into a trap of exquisite simplicity and ruthlessness. As they entered the palace, they were separated from their men and surrounded by Cesare's loyal guards. There was no struggle. There were no grand speeches. The mask of friendship dropped, and they saw the cold, reptilian face of the man they had betrayed. They knew in that instant that they were dead men. What followed was not a passionate act of revenge, but a cold, methodical execution. Cesare, it is said, calmly watched from a window as two of the captains, Vitelli and Oliverotto, were taken into a room and strangled with a garrote. He waited until he received word from Rome that his father had simultaneously arrested the head of the Orsini family, before giving the order for the other two captains to be dealt with in the same silent, efficient manner. There was no trial, no public spectacle. It was pest control. It was, as one historian put it, a masterpiece of political hygiene. An eyewitness to these events was a Florentine diplomat who had been sent to observe Cesare's court. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and he was taking copious notes. What Machiavelli saw in Cesare was not just a successful thug. He saw something entirely new, a prince who understood the true nature of power, a ruler who was not bound by conventional morality, who understood that fear was a more reliable tool than love, that it was sometimes necessary for a prince to be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. He saw a man who had mastered the art of using virtue as a costume and violence as a surgical instrument. When Machiavelli later wrote his famous and controversial book The Prince, a handbook for rulers on how to acquire and maintain power, the primary model, the central case study for his ideal prince, was Cesare Borgia. Chapter after chapter, the lessons Machiavelli draws are illustrated with the actions of the Duke. When he writes that a prince must know how to be cruel, but to use that cruelty well, swiftly, efficiently, and then be done with it, he is describing Cesare at Senigallia. When he writes that a prince should not keep his word when it is to his disadvantage, he is thinking of the false promises Cesare made to his rebellious captains. Cesare Borgia did not read Machiavelli's book. He was the book. He was the living, breathing embodiment of this new, terrifyingly pragmatic political science. By the beginning of 1503, Cesare Borgia was at the absolute zenith of his power. He was the undisputed master of a large, unified state in central Italy. He was the commander of the most effective army on the peninsula. He was feared and respected throughout Europe. His father, the Pope, doted on him, channeling the vast wealth and spiritual authority of the Church into his son's secular projects. It seemed that nothing could stop them. They were on the verge of creating a permanent, hereditary Borgia kingdom, fundamentally reshaping the map of Italy and the nature of the papacy itself. They had outmaneuvered their rivals, crushed their enemies, and silenced all dissent. They had planned for every contingency, anticipated every threat. But there is one variable that even the most brilliant and ruthless of princes cannot control. There is one enemy that cannot be tricked, bribed, or strangled in a back room, and that enemy is fortune, or to put it more plainly, sheer dumb luck. In the hot malarial summer of August 1503, as Cesare was preparing for his next campaign to expand his kingdom even further, both he and his father fell gravely ill after attending a dinner in the fever-ridden swamps that surrounded Rome in the summer. This was not unusual, but this illness would prove to be the one trap from which the Borgias could not escape. It was the beginning of the end. The foundation of their entire magnificent, terrifying edifice was about to crumble, not from the attack of an army, but from the bite of a mosquito. The great game was about to be turned on its head, and the fate of Cesare, the man who seemed to be the master of his own destiny, would now hang by the thinnest of threads. Chapter 5. Lucrezia Borgia, political pawn and Duchess of Ferrara. And so, as the late summer heat pressed down on Rome, the news of this sudden violent illness would have travelled north. It would have moved faster than a marching army, carried on the lips of merchants and messengers, a whispered rumour that grew louder with every mile. It would have finally reached the city of Ferrara, a place of refined, ancient brick and cool marble, a world away from the feverish intensity of the Vatican. And there, the news would have found Lucrezia. She was no longer Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter. She was now Lucrezia d'Este, Duchess of Ferrara, wife to the heir of one of Italy's oldest and most respected noble families. We have to imagine her hearing it, perhaps in a quiet courtyard, the sound of a fountain trickling nearby, the air thick with the scent of jasmine, a messenger, breathless and dusty from the road, delivering the dispatch. Her father, the indomitable Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, the terrifying Cesare, were both struck down, possibly by poison, more likely by the same malignant fever that claimed so many in the Roman swamps. In that moment, as the world of her childhood began to collapse hundreds of miles away, we can only wonder what she felt. Fear, certainly, a daughter's concern, perhaps. But maybe, just maybe, deep beneath the layers of duty and decorum, there was a flicker of something else, a strange, quiet and profound sense of release. The two great, terrifying forces that had charted every star in her sky, that had used her life as a map for their own ambitions, were finally losing their grip. The strings of the puppet were fraying. To understand how she reached this point, sitting in the relative safety of Ferrara while her family's empire crumbled, we have to go back. We have to unravel the story not of the monster, but of the political pawn, and see how that pawn learned to play the game for herself. Lucrezia Borgia enters the historical stage as a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, with long golden hair that was said to shine like the sun. And almost immediately, she is a commodity. In our world, a child of that age is concerned with friendships, with learning, with discovering who they are. In Lucrezia's world, she was a piece on the board, and her value was measured in the quality of the alliance her marriage could secure. Her father, the newly minted Pope Alexander VI, needed allies. The papacy was powerful, but it wasn't an island. It needed friendly states to its north, to its south, to act as buffers and enforcers. And so, a husband was sought for the golden-haired girl. The man chosen was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. He was a member of the powerful Sforza clan that ruled Milan, but he himself was a minor lord, a respectable name, a strategic if small territory. You might call him a starter husband. He was a good opening move, but not the end game. The wedding in 1493 was a classic Borgia affair. It was opulent, extravagant, and just a little bit scandalous, with whispers of entertainments that went on long into the night. Lucrezia, at just 13, was the radiant centerpiece of it all, a symbol of her family's newfound power. She was now a married woman, a contessa, tied to a man almost twice her age, whom she barely knew. Her duty was simple: to exist, to be the living seal on a political contract. But the thing about contracts in Renaissance Italy is that the ink was never truly dry. The political landscape shifted like sand in the wind. The great threat and the great opportunity of the era was France. The French king Charles VIII had a claim to the throne of Naples, and in 1494 he decided to enforce it, marching his massive army down the entire length of Italy. This single event threw every alliance into chaos. It was like someone had kicked over the chessboard, and in this new chaotic game, Giovanni Sforza and his powerful Milanese cousins made a fatal mistake. They sided with the French. Suddenly, Lucrezia's husband wasn't just a minor ally. He was a political liability. He was now connected to the very people threatening the Pope's power in Italy. For Alexander and Cesare, this was unacceptable. An alliance that is no longer useful is a problem to be solved. Giovanni Sforza had to go. But you can't just dismiss the Lord of Pesaro. There are rules, there is decorum, so the Borgias sought an annulment. The official reason they settled on was, shall we say, a delicate one. They claimed that the marriage had never been consummated, that Giovanni Sforza was impotent. Now we have to pause here and appreciate the sheer brutal humiliation of this tactic. In a world where a nobleman's virility was directly linked to his honour and his power, the Pope was about to officially declare, in front of all of Christendom, that Giovanni Sforza was incapable of performing his husbandly duties. It was a character assassination of the highest order. Giovanni, naturally, was outraged. He furiously insisted he was more than capable. The Vatican, with a straight face, proposed a test, a supervised encounter with his wife, and perhaps some other women, just to be sure. It was a circus. Giovanni, facing the choice between public humiliation and certain death, if he continued to defy the Pope, chose humiliation. He signed the papers, admitting to the charge, and the marriage was dissolved. Lucrezia, now 17, was single again. But a spurned man is a dangerous man. Giovanni couldn't fight the Borgias with an army, but he could fight them with words, and so he unleashed the most potent and lasting weapon against them, a rumour. He allegedly told his cousin, the Duke of Milan, that the only reason the Pope wanted Lucrezia back was so that he and his son Cesare could have her for themselves. It was the birth of the great dark legend of Borgia incest. Think about the logic of it from his perspective. It's the perfect counter-narrative. He wasn't impotent. He was saying he was simply prevented from touching his wife because her father and brother were already sleeping with her. It was a lie born of pure spite, a poisonous seed planted in the fertile ground of Rome's gossip mill, and it grew, and it twisted, until it became the central pillar of the black legend of Lucrezia Borgia. For centuries, she would be defined by a lie told by a humiliated ex-husband, a man her family had discarded like a broken toy. The period after her first annulment was a strange and murky one. Lucrezia was kept in seclusion in a convent, waiting for her family to decide her next move. It was during this time that the scandal of the infans Romanus, the Roman child, emerged. A baby boy named Giovanni Borgia appeared, and two contradictory papal bulls were issued. One claimed he was the son of Cesare, another, issued secretly, claimed he was the son of Pope Alexander himself. The truth has been lost to the swirling mists of history. Was Lucrezia the mother? Was the child the product of an affair she had while waiting for her next husband? Was it a fiction to legitimize one of her brother's or father's children? We will likely never know. But for us, watching from the comfort of our quiet rooms, it serves as another reminder of the murky, morally ambiguous world she was navigating. Secrets and lies were the very air she breathed. Soon enough, the political winds shifted again, and a new husband was required. The Borgia ambition had grown. Cesare was carving out a kingdom for himself in central Italy, and for that he needed a powerful southern ally. The target was the Kingdom of Naples, and so a match was arranged between Lucrezia, now 18, and Alfonso of Aragon, the Duke of Bisceglie. He was the illegitimate son of the King of Naples, just 17 years old, and by all accounts, incredibly handsome and charming. This marriage, unlike the first, seemed to be a genuine romance. The young couple were reportedly deeply in love. They were the beautiful golden couple of Rome. For a brief shining moment, Lucrezia's life seemed to have found a kind of normal, happy rhythm. She had a husband she adored, and in 1499 she gave birth to a son, Rodrigo of Aragon. She was a wife, a mother, living in a palace in the shadow of St. Peter's Angs. It must have felt like she had finally found a safe harbour. But a safe harbour is an illusion when your brother is Cesare Borgia. Because once again, the chessboard was kicked over. Cesare, ever the opportunist, decided that his future lay not with an alliance with Naples, but with an alliance with their greatest enemy, France. He married a French princess and pledged his armies to the French king's cause. And just like that, Lucrezia's beloved husband, Alfonso of Aragon, a Neapolitan prince, went from being a strategic asset to being a catastrophic liability. He was a living, breathing symbol of an old alliance that now stood in the way of Cesare's new ambition. And Cesare did not tolerate obstacles. The air in Rome grew cold for the young prince. He could feel the danger. He fled the city once, but Lucrezia, either out of love or papal command, convinced him to return. It was a fatal mistake. In the summer of 1500, as Alfonso was climbing the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, he was set upon by a group of assassins. He was stabbed multiple times, but miraculously, he survived. He was carried, bleeding, into the Vatican apartments, where a terrified Lucrezia took charge of his care. She nursed him herself, tasted his food for fear of poison, and barricaded them in their rooms, allowing only trusted doctors to enter. For over a month, it seemed like he might recover. Lucrezia was fighting, with everything she had, to keep her husband, her happiness, alive. It was a futile effort. One evening, as Lucrezia was lured from the room by a summons, Cesare's chief enforcer, the infamous Micheletto Carella, slipped inside. Alfonso's protestations were useless. The young duke was strangled in his bed. He was 18 years old. Cesare, when questioned, was brutally honest. He claimed Alfonso had tried to kill him, and that he had simply acted in self-defense. "What is not done by noon," he was reported to have said, "can be done by evening." It was a cold, chilling statement of his philosophy. Problems were to be eliminated, efficiently and permanently. Lucrezia was heartbroken. Her perfect, brief happiness had been murdered at the direct order of her own brother. She was sent away from Rome to grieve, a young widow with an infant son. She was 20 years old, and her life was already a graveyard of political expediency. She had been married for an alliance, unmarried for convenience, and now widowed for ambition. Each move had been dictated by her father and brother, her own feelings a complete irrelevance. One can only imagine the deep, crushing cynicism that must have been taking root in her heart. She was learning, in the harshest way possible, that in her world, love and loyalty were dangerous luxuries. The only thing that mattered was power. And so, after a suitable period of mourning, the great Borgia machine turned its attention to her third and final marriage. This was to be the masterpiece, the culmination of all their social and political climbing. The target was Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This was a different league entirely. The d'Este family was ancient, aristocratic, and universally respected. They were true old money nobility, who looked down on upstarts like the Borgias with undisguised contempt. A marriage alliance with Ferrara would be the ultimate stamp of legitimacy. It would be like a tech billionaire marrying into the British royal family. It would wash away the stain of their Spanish origins, of their scandalous reputation. It would make them, finally, undeniable. There was just one problem. The d'Este family was utterly horrified by the prospect. Duke Ercole d'Este, Alfonso's father, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Borgias. Marry his son and heir to Lucrezia, the woman whose first marriage was annulled on claims of her husband's impotence, whose second husband was murdered in his sickbed by her brother. The woman whispered to have incestuous relations with that same brother and her own father, the Pope. The optics, as we would say today, were terrible. It was a public relations nightmare. Duke Ercole politely, and then not so politely, refused. But the Borgias did not take no for an answer. What followed was less a marriage negotiation and more of a relentless high-pressure campaign. Pope Alexander threatened Duke Ercole with political isolation, with the loss of church territories, with the full weight of papal displeasure, which was a very heavy weight indeed. Meanwhile, let his armies linger menacingly near the Ferrarese border, a silent, steel-toothed promise of what could happen if the Duke remained stubborn. And then there was the money. Alexander offered an absolutely colossal dowry, 200,000 ducats, an astronomical sum, along with jewels, fine clothes, and valuable lands. He was essentially making an offer the Duke couldn't refuse. It was a hostile takeover, but for a daughter-in-law. Reluctantly, grimly, Duke Ercole gave in. He had been bullied, threatened, and bribed into accepting a woman he considered utterly beneath his family's station. The marriage contract was signed. Lucrezia Borgia, the pawn, was about to make her most important move yet. In the winter of 1502, Lucrezia left Rome for Ferrara. She would never see her father or her brother again. Her procession north was a carefully orchestrated piece of theatre. It was a magnificent spectacle of wealth and power, designed to awe and impress her new family. She was draped in jewels and velvets, accompanied by a retinue of over 1,000 people. This wasn't the grieving widow or the discarded wife. This was a powerful princess arriving to claim her new home. She was performing the role of her life, and she knew everything depended on it. Her arrival in Ferrara was a tense affair. Her new husband, Alfonso, was cold and distant. Her father-in-law, Duke Ercole, was watchful and suspicious. The entire Ferrara's court, one of the most cultured and sophisticated in Europe, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They saw the Borgia scandal, the symbol of everything crass and corrupt about the new powers in Rome. They expected a monster, a poisoner, a femme fatale. What they got was something entirely different. They got a woman of incredible intelligence, charm, and grace. Lucrezia understood her situation perfectly. She wasn't in the brutal, anything-goes world of Borgia Rome anymore. This was a court of ancient traditions, of subtle gestures, of art and poetry, and she adapted. She shed the skin of the Borgia pawn, and began for the first time to build a life and a reputation that were entirely her own. She established a court that became a beacon of Renaissance culture. She was a generous and discerning patron of the arts. She befriended the great poet Pietro Bembo, who wrote soaring verses in her honor. She was a patron to the artist Titian. The great writer Ariosto included her in his epic poem, Orlando Furioso, praising her beauty, virtue, and intelligence. This wasn't just a hobby, this was a strategic move. By aligning herself with the greatest cultural figures of the age, she was rebranding herself. She was replacing the dark Borgia legend with a new narrative, Lucrezia d'Este, the cultivated and benevolent Duchess. Her relationship with her husband, Alfonso, slowly thawed. It may never have been a passionate romance like her union with Alfonso of Aragon, but it grew into a partnership of deep, mutual respect. She gave him what he and his family needed most, heirs. She bore him several children, securing the d'Este line for the next generation. This was her primary duty, and she fulfilled it flawlessly. But she did more than that. Alfonso was a stern military man, often away from Ferrara, fighting in the seemingly endless Italian wars. In his absence, he trusted Lucrezia to govern the duchy as his regent, and she was brilliant at it. She proved to be a shrewd and compassionate ruler. She oversaw the city's finances, managed its legal system, and undertook massive public works projects, including a plan to drain the nearby marshlands to create more fertile farmland for her people. She was beloved by the citizens of Ferrara, who saw her not as a foreign Borgia, but as their duchess, a fair and capable leader who cared for their welfare. If you think about the journey, it's astonishing. The young girl, traded like a silk scarf between powerful men, had become a powerful woman in her own right, ruling a respected state, her authority based not on her family's name, but on her own proven competence. Then, in the late summer of 1503, the news she must have been expecting for years finally arrived. The news we started with. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, was dead. Her brother, Cesare, though he survived the fever, was a broken man, his power base dissolving overnight without the protection of the papacy. The entire Borgia edifice, built on a foundation of ambition, ruthlessness, and papal authority, came crashing down. Their enemies, so long held at bay, swarmed in for the kill. Cesare was arrested, exiled, and would eventually die in a minor skirmish in Spain a few years later, a sad echo of his former glory. And Lucrezia was in Ferrara, safe, untouchable. Her family's spectacular rise was matched only by its spectacular fall, but she was insulated from it. Her connection to the d'Este family, the very alliance that was meant to be the crowning achievement of the Borgia project, had become her lifeboat. She had not only survived her family, she had in a way transcended them. She lived for another 16 years. She watched as her son by Alfonso of Aragon, her little Rodrigo, was taken from her and died young. She endured the pain of several stillbirths. Her life was not without sorrow, but it was her own. She became increasingly devout in her later years, trading her lavish gowns for simple, plain habits, spending much of her time in prayer and charity. When she died in 1519 at the age of 39, following complications from childbirth, she was mourned deeply throughout Ferrara. Her husband, the once cold Alfonso d'Este, was said to be inconsolable, writing that he felt as if he had lost a part of himself. This is the real story of Lucrezia Borgia. It's not a tale of poisons and incest, of a black-hearted monster scheming in the shadows. That was a caricature, a myth created by her family's enemies and fueled by centuries of sensationalism. The truth is quieter, and in many ways more remarkable. It's the story of a survivor, a woman born into a world of terrifying men, used as a tool, her happiness and her very life subject to the cold calculations of politics. She was broken and betrayed, but she never allowed herself to be destroyed. She learned the rules of the game she was forced to play, and when she was finally given a chance, on the board of Ferrara, she played it with a skill and grace that no one, least of all her own family, could have ever predicted. She outlived the infamy. While the name Borgia became a whisper, a byword for every sin imaginable, the name Lucrezia d'Este, Duchess of Ferrara, was remembered with respect. She was the one who got away, the one who laundered the family name, not with violence or intrigue, but with competence, culture, and a quiet, unyielding resilience. The golden-haired pawn had become a queen in her own right, long after the kings who had moved her were swept from the board forever. Chapter 6. The apex of infamy, the height of Borgia power. But while Lucrezia was building a new life on a different board, the game in Rome was reaching its frantic, terrifying peak. The kings who had moved her were not just still on the board, they had practically flipped it over, declared themselves the winners, and were now systematically removing any opposing pieces with a chilling finality. For a few brief incandescent years from around 1500 to 1503, the Borgia family wasn't just a powerful dynasty, they were Rome, they were the papacy. They were a force of nature that seemed as unstoppable as a flood, and just as destructive. This was their apex, the high water mark of their power, and with it, the absolute summit of their infamy. To understand this moment, you have to imagine Rome not as the holy city, but as the headquarters of a sprawling, ruthlessly efficient multinational corporation that has just completed a hostile takeover, Borgia Inc., and at its head sat the aging but still formidable CEO, Pope Alexander VI. He was now in his 70s, an age when most men were contemplating their eternal souls. Rodrigo Borgia, however, was contemplating the map of Italy and how much more of it could be brought under the family brand. He was the master of the long game, the one who understood the intricate levers of power, both sacred and profoundly profane. He could excommunicate a king with one hand, while signing a loan with the other. His genius was in recognizing that the papacy, for all its spiritual trappings, was the single greatest political and financial engine in Europe, and he was determined to use every ounce of its fuel for the advancement of his children. And if Alexander was the CEO, then his son Cesare was the chief operating officer, the enforcer, the man sent to handle the company's most aggressive acquisitions. While his father managed the boardroom in Rome, Cesare was out in the field, a whirlwind of violence and strategy, tearing through the patchwork of city-states in central Italy, known as the Romagna. Cesare had finally shed his cardinal's robes for good, and it was like watching a hawk shed a cage. He was born for this. He moved with a speed and a ruthlessness that left his contemporaries breathless. His opponents were the old feudal lords of Italy, men who fought with chivalric codes and seasonal campaigns. Cesare fought like something new, something modern. He used deception, winter campaigns, swift sieges, and political assassination as easily as other generals used cavalry. He was, in the cold eyes of a young Niccolo Machiavelli, who watched him with a kind of horrified admiration, the perfect embodiment of the new prince, a man unburdened by morality, guided only by efficiency and the ferocious pursuit of his own goals. City after city fell to him: Imola, Forlì, Rimini, Faenza. He would arrive, conquer, and then, crucially, install a government that was often more stable and less corrupt than the one he had replaced. It's a strange and often forgotten part of his legacy. For the average peasant, life under the notoriously cruel local lords was often miserable. Cesare, for all his sins, brought a strange kind of order. He was a monster, yes, but he was an organized monster, and sometimes that's an improvement. His reputation preceded him, a wave of terror that did half the work for him. It was said that Cesare Borgia's cruelty was only exceeded by his charm, and his charm was only exceeded by his treachery. You might be his ally one day, and find your castle under siege the next. You might be invited to dinner as a friend and find yourself in his dungeons by dessert. It was this terrifying unpredictability that made him so effective. The old rules no longer applied. The only rule was what Cesare wanted. Back in Rome, this new reality created an atmosphere thick with fear and ambition. The Vatican, which was always a nest of intrigue, became a place of whispered conversations and sideways glances. To be an enemy of the Borgias was no longer just a political inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. Cardinals who had the poor judgment to possess great wealth and a weak allegiance to the Pope began to suffer from a startlingly fatal series of illnesses. One would complain of a stomachache after dining at the Vatican and be dead by morning. Another would be arrested on charges of treason, his vast fortune conveniently reverting to the papal treasury, and he would expire of grief in his cell. It was a remarkably efficient way of funding Cesare's wars and clearing the board of troublesome players. The city held its breath. The Tiber River, that ancient muddy artery of Rome, became the final resting place for many who crossed the family. Bodies would be fished out in the morning, often with a stone tied to their necks, their pockets turned inside out. There was rarely an investigation. Everyone knew, and because everyone knew, no one dared to speak. It was a silence born of pure, rational terror. And in this fertile ground of fear, the most lurid stories began to grow. The legend of the Borgias was cemented in these years, not just by their real actions, which were brutal enough, but by the rumours that swirled around them, stories that took on a life of their own. They became the canvas onto which all of Europe projected its darkest fears and fantasies about power. The ghost that haunted them most was the one that lay in the family's past, the unsolved murder of the Pope's favourite son, Juan Borgia. Though it had happened a few years earlier, the spectre of his death hung over Cesare's rise. Juan, the handsome, arrogant, and frankly incompetent Duke of Gandia, had been his father's first choice to lead the papal armies. He was the golden boy, and then one night in 1497, he vanished after a dinner party. His body was found in the Tiber a few days later, riddled with stab wounds. The city buzzed with theories. Was it the Orsini family, bitter rivals of the Borgias? Was it a jealous husband? But the most persistent whisper, the one that never quite went away, pointed directly at his own brother, Cesare. The motive was plain as day: ambition. With one out of the way, Cesare was the only one left to carry the family's secular military ambitions. He was the competent one, the ruthless one, held back only by his brother's favour. No one ever proved it. Alexander, heartbroken, launched a massive investigation that was suddenly and mysteriously called off. The silence from the Vatican on the matter was deafening. Whether he did it or not almost ceased to matter. People believed he was capable of it, and in the game of power and fear that was just as good. It added another layer to his terrifying mystique. A man who might have committed fratricide for power was not a man you wanted to cross. But even the spectre of fratricide paled in comparison to the other great rumour, the one that truly sealed the Borgia name in the annals of infamy. It was the ultimate taboo, the most poisonous accusation you could level against a Holy Father and his family: incest. The whispers clung to Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia like a shroud. This story, too, had its roots in political manoeuvring. When the Borgias needed to break Lucrezia's first marriage to Giovanni Sforza, they sought an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation. Sforza, publicly humiliated and furious, allegedly retaliated by spreading the rumour that the Pope wanted Lucrezia for himself. It was a slander of pure political genius. It was so monstrous, so beyond the pale, that it was impossible to defend against. How do you disprove such a thing? The charge stuck. It was repeated in the courts of Italy, whispered by ambassadors, and written in the secret diaries of Vatican officials. It was expanded to include Cesare, painting a picture of a depraved family locked in a web of unspeakable desires. It didn't have to be true. It just had to be believable enough to a world that was already convinced the Borgias were capable of anything. It became the defining stain on their name, the one that would follow them through history, turning them from mere political villains into figures of Gothic horror. And then there were the parties. Oh, the parties. The most notorious of these was the so-called Banquet of the Chestnuts. The story comes to us from the diary of a Vatican official, Johann Burchard, a man who documented the goings-on of the papal court with a meticulous, almost robotic detachment. According to Burchard, in October of 1501, Cesare Borgia hosted a dinner in his Vatican apartments. After the meal, the tables were cleared, and dozens of courtesans were brought in. Chestnuts were scattered on the floor, and the courtesans, crawling on their hands and knees, competed to pick them up, cheered on by the Pope, Cesare and Lucrezia, who were allegedly present. Burchard's account goes on to describe even more debauched activities, a lurid spectacle of pure decadence. Now we have to pause and take a breath here. Think of it as the 16th century equivalent of a wild tabloid story that goes viral. Did it happen exactly as Burchard described? It's almost impossible to say. Burchard was a stickler for ceremony, and may have been deeply offended by the Borgias' more relaxed Spanish customs. The story could be a wild exaggeration, or an outright fabrication by their enemies, put into the mouth of a credible witness. But like the other rumours, its truthfulness is almost secondary to its impact. The story spread like wildfire. It perfectly encapsulated everything their enemies wanted to believe about them, that they were not just politically corrupt, but morally bankrupt, pagans sitting on the throne of St. Peter, turning the holy precincts of the Vatican into a den of iniquity. So you have this perfect storm. In the real world, a ruthless and unstoppable military and political machine systematically crushing all opposition, and in the world of rumour and propaganda, a family of monsters capable of murder, incest, and orgies that would make a Roman emperor blush. The two worlds fed each other. The more powerful the Borgias became, the more monstrous the stories grew, and the more monstrous the stories grew, the more people feared them, making them even more powerful. It was a terrifying, self-perpetuating cycle. During these years, to live in Rome was to walk on eggshells. The city was outwardly celebrating a jubilee year, filled with pilgrims seeking salvation, but beneath the surface it was a city of paranoia. Friends betrayed friends. A careless word in a tavern could lead to a quiet knock on the door in the middle of the night. Cesare employed a chief enforcer, a notoriously cruel Spanish captain named Micheletto Carella, who became his shadow. Micheletto was the man who handled the delicate matters, When a powerful opponent of the Borgias was found strangled in his bed, it was assumed to be the work of Micheletto. He was the physical manifestation of Cesare's will, a silent, deadly instrument that kept the city in a state of perpetual anxiety. And yet, for all its seeming invincibility, the entire Borgia Empire was built on a foundation of sand. Everything Sauer's army, the family's wealth, their political power, their ability to defy all of Europe, rested on the life of one man, a man in his 70s. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. Every cardinal they bought, every enemy they eliminated, every castle Cesare conquered, was part of a desperate race against time. They were trying to build a hereditary kingdom for Cesare in central Italy, something permanent that would outlast the papacy. They needed the papal machine to build it, but they knew that the moment Alexander's heart stopped beating, the machine would turn on them. A new pope would be elected, likely an enemy of the Borgias, and the full weight of the church and all the resentful powers of Italy would come crashing down on Cesare. He knew it. Alexander knew it. They were working with a furious intensity, a frantic energy born of the knowledge that their window of opportunity was terrifyingly finite. For now, they were untouchable. Cesare was the master of central Italy. Alexander held the keys to heaven and earth. The family coffers were overflowing with the wealth of repurposed cardinal estates. Their enemies were dead in exile, or too frightened to move. They stood at the very pinnacle, gazing out at a world that was, for all intents and purposes, theirs. But it was a dizzying height, and the wind was picking up, and they both knew that the entire mountain they stood upon was held in place by the fraying thread of a single, aging heartbeat. The apex was glorious, but it was also a precipice, and the fall was coming. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Sting, the Death of a Pope, and the Fall of a Prince. And so we leave them there for a moment, on that precipice, father and son, masters of their world. The apex was indeed glorious, but as they stood there breathing in the rarefied air of absolute power, the frayed thread of that single aging heartbeat was beginning to vibrate. The fall wasn't just coming, it was already uncoiling itself in the sweltering, fever-ridden heat of a Roman August. It was a fall that would begin, as so many Borgia enterprises did, at a dinner party. The summer of 1503 was, even by Roman standards, a truly miserable affair. The sun beat down on the 7 hills with a kind of personal animosity, turning the city's narrow streets into brick ovens and its grand piazzas into shimmering, blinding sheets of light. The Tiber, low and sluggish, was a murky green-brown, and from the marshy grounds that surrounded the city, a miasma seemed to rise with the dusk. It was an air you could almost chew, thick with humidity, the smell of dust, unwashed humanity, and something else, something ancient and menacing that bred in the stagnant water. It was, to be frank, a perfect season for getting sick. The invitation was for dinner at the vineyard of Cardinal Adriano Castelli de Corneto, a lovely evening out, a chance to escape the suffocating heat of the Vatican palaces and enjoy a pleasant meal with a wealthy and therefore useful friend. On the 6th of August, Pope Alexander, Cesare, and a few other select guests made their way to the Cardinal's villa. Now history has 2 stories to tell about this particular dinner, and they run on parallel tracks, one steeped in sinister theatrics, and the other in mundane, deadly biology. For centuries the first story was the one everyone believed. It was just so Borgia. In this version, the Pope and his son arrived with a little party favour of their own, a specially prepared batch of poisoned wine. The target, naturally, was their host, the fabulously wealthy Cardinal Cornetto. The plan was the usual, brutally efficient Borgia retirement plan. The Cardinal would drink the wine, suffer a sudden and tragic illness, and his vast fortune and collection of desirable offices would, through the compassionate administration of the Holy See, find their way into the Borgia family coffers. It was a business model that had, until now, proven remarkably successful. The story goes that through a mix-up, a slip of the hand by a nervous butler, or perhaps a last-minute switching of the decanters, the poisoned wine intended for the host was served instead to the guests of honour. Alexander and Cesare, authors of the plot, became its accidental victims. It is an account filled with a kind of grim Shakespearean irony. The master poisoners, undone by their own favourite tool, the serpent, in its eagerness to strike, biting its own tail. It's a story so perfect, so poetically just, that it feels like it has to be true. But then there is the other story, a story less dramatic but perhaps far more terrifying in its sheer randomness. This story is whispered not by scheming courtiers, but by the buzzing of a billion tiny wings rising from the Pontine marshes. The story of malaria. Rome in August was a paradise for the mosquito, and the fever it carried, what was known as the aria cativa, the bad air, was the city's great and indiscriminate executioner. It didn't care if you were a beggar or a pope. If it found you, it would shake you with chills, burn you with fever, and leave you a hollowed-out wreck. So what happened? Was it the perfect poison plot gone wrong, or a simple, unlucky mosquito bite? The truth is, we will never know for sure. Historians today lean heavily towards malaria, or some other virulent fever. The symptoms, the time of year, the fact that other people in the city were also falling ill, it all points to a natural cause. But the legend of the poison, the tale of the Borgias' final fatal miscalculation, has a power all its own. It speaks to the terror they inspired, the belief that their end could only come from a darkness as profound as the one they themselves wielded. Perhaps, for our purposes, as we drift here in the quiet of the night, it doesn't much matter which is true, whether it was a vial of cantarella or the bite of an insect. The result was the same. A few days after that pleasant dinner, on August 12th, both Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare fell violently ill. The thread that held their entire world together had not just frayed, it had snapped. Imagine the scene within the apostolic palace. In one set of lavish chambers, a 72-year-old man, the vicar of Christ, is suddenly consumed by a fire from within. Alexander, a man whose physical constitution was the stuff of legend, a bull of a man who had seemed almost immortal, was brought low with shocking speed. He was seized by recurring waves of fever, each more violent than the last, followed by bone-rattling chills that made the sweltering August air feel like the dead of winter. His legendary appetite vanished, replaced by bouts of vomiting. The Pope, the rock upon which the Borgia church was built, was crumbling, and in another set of rooms, just a short walk away, his son, the fearsome Duke Valentino, the terror of Italy, was going through the very same hell. Cesare, a man in his late 20s, at the absolute peak of his physical prowess, was utterly incapacitated. This was a man whose entire career was built on speed, decisiveness, and relentless action. When a problem arose, he didn't delegate or deliberate. He got on a horse and rode at it until it was no longer a problem. Now he couldn't even stand. The mind that had outwitted every condottiero and schemer in Italy was clouded by delirium. The body that was the most dangerous weapon in his own arsenal had betrayed him. He was pinned to his bed, helpless, while the world he had built began to tremble. If you've ever had a truly debilitating flu, you know that feeling of complete and utter helplessness, where the world shrinks to the four corners of your bed. Now, imagine having that, but with the added pressure that if you don't get up and personally hold your empire together, it will instantly dissolve, and all of your sworn enemies will descend on your house to murder your family and salt the earth where you stood. It's a powerful incentive to get well, but fever, unfortunately, doesn't respond to threats. The physicians of the day, working with a medical understanding that was a charming blend of ancient Greek theory and outright guesswork, did what they could. For the Pope, they prescribed the usual regimen of bleeding and purging, which likely only weakened him further. For Cesare, a man of legendary vitality, more extreme measures were apparently taken. One story, perhaps apocryphal but too vivid to ignore, claims that in an attempt to break his fever, his doctors had a bull disemboweled and had Cesare climb inside the warm, bloody carcass, hoping the animal's residual life force would somehow be transferred to him. Another tale speaks of him being submerged repeatedly in a tub of ice-cold water. It's a horrifying image. The great Duke, the master of his own destiny, reduced to a piece of meat being subjected to bizarre and desperate remedies. But it shows the panic that was setting in. If Cesare went down, everything went down. For 6 agonizing days the battle raged in both men's bodies. The Pope's condition worsened steadily. By August 18th, it was clear the end was near. He was given the last rites, and as he lay dying, the true nature of the Vatican court revealed itself. Even before the Pope's final breath had left his body, the looting began. Servants, guards, and minor officials who had bowed and scraped before him just days earlier now scurried through the papal apartments like rats, grabbing tapestries, silver, and anything of value that wasn't nailed down. It was a time-honoured tradition. When a pope died, the palace was considered fair game until order was restored. And for Alexander, the man who had perfected the art of confiscating the wealth of others, the plundering was particularly swift and thorough. His death chamber was stripped bare while he was still occupying it. He died in the evening, and almost immediately, The whispers about poison became a roar. The cause? The state of the body. In the crushing August heat, with no means of refrigeration, a corpse would of course decompose quickly. But Alexander's body, according to horrified eyewitnesses, seemed to decay at a supernatural rate. It swelled, turned a dark purplish black, and began to emit a horrific stench. His face became, in the words of one chronicler, the most ugly, monstrous and horrible thing to see, without any human form or likeness. When the time came for the public viewing, a ceremony meant to confirm the Pope's death and allow the faithful to pay their respects, the guards had to use poles to literally stuff the bloated corpse into its coffin because it no longer fit. To the people of Rome, this was not the work of malaria. This was the devil coming to claim his own. This was divine, or rather, infernal proof of the poisoned wine. They saw it as the physical manifestation of a corrupted soul, his body putrefying on the outside as his spirit had on the inside. The story of the Borgia Pope, who had lived a life of sin, ending in a spectacle of grotesque horror, was complete. While his father's reputation was being sealed in that too small coffin, Cesare was still fighting. He was younger, stronger, and he survived the initial onslaught of the fever, but he had won a Pyrrhic victory. He was alive, yes, but he was weak, bedridden, and utterly powerless at the single most critical moment of his life. The Borgia enterprise was a finely tuned machine, a marvel of ruthless efficiency, but it had a fatal design flaw. It required two operators. Alexander was the strategist, the source of legitimacy, and most importantly, the money. Cesare was the enforcer, the muscle, the CEO who executed the board's decisions with terrifying speed. One without the other was useless. The entire system was predicated on them working in perfect concert. And now, one was dead, and the other might as well have been. The news of the Pope's death spread through Italy like a shockwave, and with it came the dawning, joyous realization for a great many powerful people: the Borgias were finished. It was open season. The first to move were the family's oldest and most bitter enemies, the great Roman barons. The Orsini clan, which Caesar had so brutally crushed, rose up as if from the grave. Fabio Orsini, whose father Paolo had been personally strangled on Caesar's orders at Sinigalia, rode into Rome at the head of a small army, screaming for Borgia blood. He galloped to the very gates of the Vatican, hoping to find Cesare and wash the stain of his family's honour from the stones. He even managed to capture Caesar's mother, Farnozza, and Lucrezia's young son Rodrigo, though they were soon released. The city of Rome, which had been held in a state of cowed obedience for a decade, exploded into chaos and factional violence. The streets became a battleground for private armies, settling old scores under the hot August sun. Meanwhile, in the Romagna, the collection of city-states that Cesare had beaten and bled into a unified duchy, the old rulers began to creep back from exile. The moment they heard the Pope was dead, they knew Cesare's authority, which had always been propped up by papal power and papal money, was now a hollow shell. Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, whom Cesare had so cleverly chased from his home, was welcomed back by his people with tears of joy. The Verano family returned to Camerino, the Sforzas to Pesaro, the Vitelli to Città di Castello. One by one, the dominoes that Cesare had so painstakingly set up began to fall, in the exact reverse order he had conquered them. His masterpiece of statecraft, the foundation of a future kingdom, was dissolving like a sandcastle in the rain, and Cesare could do nothing but lie in his sickbed and listen to the reports. Every messenger brought worse news. A city lost here, a fortress surrendered there, an ally switching sides, a commander of his troops deserting. Imagine the torment, to have the mind of a predator, the instincts of a wolf, but to be trapped in the frail body of a newborn kitten. He was lucid enough to understand the full scope of the catastrophe, but too weak to lift a hand to stop it. His entire life's work, his grand ambition, everything he had schemed and fought and murdered for, was unravelling before his eyes, and all he could do was sweat and shiver and curse his own traitorous body. He did try. Even from his bed, the old instincts kicked in. He gathered what loyal troops he had left in Rome under the command of his most trusted general, Micheletto. He had his father's remaining treasure, a vast sum in gold and jewels, secured and brought to him, money and soldiers. They were the only two languages his world understood. He still had some cards to play, but his hand was getting weaker by the hour. His most pressing problem was the upcoming papal election. Everything, absolutely everything, depended on getting a friendly pope onto the throne of St. Peter, a pope who would confirm his title as Duke of Romagna reappoint him as gonfalonier of the church, and continue to fund his armies. Without that, he was just another warlord with a dwindling army, and no legitimate claim to anything. The cardinals began to assemble for the conclave, and they were, to put it mildly, in no mood to do the Borgias any more favours. For years they had lived in fear of Alexander and Cesare. They had seen their colleagues poisoned, exiled, and stripped of their wealth. Now, for the first time in a decade, they could breathe freely, and they were breathing fire. Among them were men who had been personally ruined by the Borgias, men who had spent years in exile, biding their time. The most formidable of these was, of course, Giuliano della Rovere, the warrior pope in waiting. He had been Alexander's nemesis from day one, a constant thorn in his side, orchestrating invasions and conspiracies from his exile in France. Now he was back in Rome, his eyes burning with a righteous fury and a very unholy ambition. He saw his moment, the chance he had been waiting for his entire adult life. Cesare, from his sickbed in the Vatican, tried to play the game. He still controlled a significant number of Spanish cardinals who owed their positions to his father. He still had Micheletto's troops camped in and around Rome. He had leverage. He met with the various factions, making promises, issuing veiled threats. He was a shadow of his former self, a ghost at the feast, but he was still Serra Borgia, and the name still carried a certain terrifying weight. His goal was to block della Rovere at all costs. He knew that if his father's greatest enemy became pope, his own life wouldn't be worth a single Roman ducat. He threw his support behind the French candidate, Cardinal d'Amboise, but the Italian cardinals would never accept a Frenchman. The conclave was deadlocked. In the end, a compromise was reached. They elected a man named Francesco Piccolomini, who took the name Pius III. He was old, frail, and crippled with gout. He was, in essence, a placeholder, a temporary solution that everyone could agree on because they all knew he wouldn't be around for very long. For Cesare, it was a minor victory. Pius III was neutral, even slightly sympathetic to him. It bought him time. He hoped it would be enough time to recover his health, march his army back to the Romagna, and reconsolidate his power before a more permanent and likely more hostile pope was elected. But fate, it seems, had finally tired of the Borgias. It had given them a decade of impossible luck, and now it was cruelly snatching it all back. Pope Pius III, the frail old man chosen to give everyone a breather, reigned for a mere 26 days before succumbing to his various ailments. The cardinals had to assemble all over again, and this time the game was different. Cesare was weaker, his enemies were stronger, and Giuliano della Rovere, the master politician, made his move. He knew he didn't have the numbers to win a straight fight, so he did something that must have been almost physically painful for him. He went to see Cesare Borgia. He found the Duke still recovering, a pale and diminished figure, and della Rovere, the man who had loathed the Borgias with every fibre of his being, made a series of breathtaking promises. He swore on the Holy Scriptures that if Cesare would deliver the votes of the Spanish cardinals and support his candidacy, he, as Pope, would confirm Cesare's title to the Romagna. He would reappoint him gonfalonier, captain of the papal armies. He would treat him as a favoured son, and help him restore his fallen state. He promised him everything he wanted to hear. It was Cesare's final fatal misjudgment. Perhaps he was still weakened by the fever. Perhaps his political instincts, once so infallibly sharp, had been dulled by his illness and desperation, or perhaps he simply had no other choice. He was cornered, his options exhausted. He looked at this powerful, determined man, his family's sworn enemy, and he chose to believe him. He instructed the Spanish cardinals to vote for della Rovere. It was a landslide. On the first ballot, Giuliano della Rovere was elected pope, and he took the name Julius II. He had won. The ultimate prize was his, and Cesare had handed it to him. For a few weeks it seemed as though Julius might actually keep his word. He treated Cesare with a wary courtesy, but the mask soon slipped. Julius II had no intention of allowing a powerful, independent Borgia state to exist on the church's northern border. That was his land, the church's land, and he wanted it back. He had used Cesare to get the papal tiara, and now he was done with him. The first move was to demand that Cesare order the commanders of his remaining fortresses in the Romagna to surrender their keys to the papacy. Cesare, to his credit, refused. Those castles were his last bargaining chips, the only thing of value he had left. Julius's response was swift. He had Cesare arrested and confined within the Vatican, the very palace where he had once been the most feared man in Italy. The checkmate was complete. Julius II now held Cesare hostage. He sent messages to the loyal Castellans in the Romagna: "Surrender your fortress, or your duke will be executed." One by one, faced with an impossible choice, they gave in. The last vestiges of the Borgia state were handed over to their greatest enemy. Cesare was now a man with no army, no land, no money, and no powerful father. He was, for the first time in his adult life, completely and utterly irrelevant. And Julius II still didn't know what to do with him. To keep him in Rome was dangerous. He was still a legendary figure who could inspire plots. To kill him would be unseemly for a new pope. So Julius made a deal with King Ferdinand of Spain. Cesare was, after all, a Spanish grandee through his dukedom of Gandia. He would be handed over to the Spanish, to be dealt with as they saw fit. In August of 1504, almost exactly 1 year after that fateful dinner party, Cesare Borgia was put on a galley and shipped to Spain. As he watched the shores of Italy fade into the distance, he must have known he would never see them again. The land he had dreamed of forging into a kingdom, the stage upon which he had played the part of a great prince, was now lost to him forever. He was taken to the castle of Chinchilla in Valencia, a grim and isolated fortress, but even there, his reputation preceded him. The governor of the castle was so terrified of his prisoner that he doubled the guard and refused to even speak to him. There were rumours of escape plots, and Ferdinand, growing nervous, had him moved to a place from which escape was thought to be truly impossible: the fortress of La Motta, in Medina del Campo, 100 miles northwest of Madrid. The Torre de Homenaje of La Motta was a truly formidable prison, a massive stone keep, a fortress within a fortress, with walls over 10 feet thick. Cesare was placed in a single room at the very top. The windows were barred, the door was heavy oak, and the only way in or out was through a trapdoor in the ceiling, from which food and supplies were lowered by rope. For 2 years, Cesare Borgia, the man of ceaseless motion, was confined to this stone box. He had nothing but time to think, time to pace the length of his small room, time to stare out at the flat, endless plains of Castile, and reflect on the sheer dizzying speed of his fall. From the master of Italy to a prisoner in a stone cage. But if Julius II and King Ferdinand thought they had finally broken him, they had underestimated the man. The old fire was not entirely extinguished. It had been banked down to a single glowing ember, but it was still there. Sendfa, with the help of a sympathetic chaplain and his loyal retainers on the outside, began to plan. The escape, when it came, was pure Borgia. It was audacious, meticulously planned, and incredibly dangerous. One dark, stormy night in October of 1506, his accomplices arrived at the base of the tower. They managed to overpower the guards at the gate of the outer fortress and signalled to him. Inside his cell, Cesare and his lone servant used a rope, painstakingly woven from bedsheets and smuggled cord, to lower themselves from the high window. It was a desperate gamble. The rope, as it turned out, was too short. Cesare was forced to let go, dropping the last 20 or 30 feet to the ground. He landed badly, injuring himself, but he was free. His men rushed to him, helped him onto a waiting horse, and they galloped off into the stormy night, vanishing before the alarm could be fully raised. It was the last great flash of the old Cesare. The cunning, the daring, the refusal to accept defeat. For a moment, it must have felt like the old days. He was once again the protagonist of his own incredible story. He made his way across northern Spain, a fugitive, and finally found refuge in the small kingdom of Navarre, which was ruled by his brother-in-law, John III. But this wasn't Italy. Navarre was a small, poor kingdom constantly threatened by its powerful neighbours. Cesare was a famous general without an army, a duke without a duchy. He was an asset, certainly, but also a liability. His brother-in-law, the king, put him to work doing the one thing he knew how to do: fight. And so we come to the final, pathetic scene of this grand, bloody opera. The year is 1507. Cesare Borgia, the former Duke of Valentinois and Romagna, the man Machiavelli saw as the potential unifier of Italy, the man who had dined with kings and brought cities to their knees, found himself leading a small force of mercenaries to lay siege to the castle of Viana. Viana was not Rome, it was not Florence or Milan, it was an insignificant town, held by a rebellious count, a minor nobleman named Louis de Beaumont, in a squabble over unpaid taxes. This was the stage for Cesare's final act, not a grand battlefield where the fate of nations was decided, but a muddy, pointless little siege in a backwater kingdom. On the night of March 11th, A violent storm of wind and freezing rain swept over the Navarrese countryside. During the chaos, a small party of the Count's men slipped out of the castle to raid the besiegers' camp for supplies. Cesare, always the aggressor, saw them. Perhaps some of the old fire flared in his gut. Perhaps he saw a chance for a moment of glory, however small. Without waiting for his own troops to assemble, he spurred his horse and charged after them, alone, into the darkness and the driving rain. He was magnificent, he was reckless, and he was foolish. He chased them down, cutting down several of the fleeing knights himself, but he had galloped far ahead of his own men. The rebels, seeing that he was alone, turned on him. He was surrounded. He fought, as he always had, like a cornered lion, but he was one man against 20. A lance unhorsed him. On the ground, in the mud and the rain, they swarmed him. He was stabbed again and again. His fine armor was stripped from his body, his pockets looted, and he was left naked and bleeding in a muddy ditch outside the walls of a town no one has ever heard of. The next morning, his men found his body. It was riddled with 23 wounds. The great Cesare Borgia, the son of a pope, the terror of Italy, had died at the age of 31, fighting over a provincial tax dispute. It was such a profoundly small end for a man who had lived such a large life. There was no poetry in it, no grand tragedy, just a kind of bleak, miserable irony. He wasn't poisoned by a rival prince, or executed on a grand scaffold in a public square. He simply bled out in the mud, his ambitions turning to dust with him. He was buried in the local church in Vienna, a final, quiet resting place for a man who had made so much noise in the world. The grand Borgia dream of a dynasty, of a kingdom, of a new order in Italy, died with him in that anonymous field. The serpent had not only stung itself, but had been trampled underfoot in the most ignominious way imaginable. The fall from the precipice was complete, and all that was left of the great Borgia century was Lucrezia, living out a quiet, respectable life in Ferrara, and a legacy of fear, brilliance, and blood that would curdle into legend. Chapter 8. The Black Legend. History, propaganda, and legacy. And so the story curdles into legend. It's a strange word, legend. It implies something grand, something whispered around campfires, something that grows larger than life with each telling. But some legends aren't born of admiration. They are forged in hatred, hammered into shape by the victors, and polished with the darkest rumours until they gleam with an iridescence of pure malevolence. This is the Black Legend. It's not just a bad reputation, it's a systematic, deliberate, and often brilliant campaign of character assassination conducted on a historical scale. And the Borgias, well, the Borgias were its masterpiece. To understand how the names of Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia became shorthand for every sin imaginable, we have to look at who was left standing when the dust settled. When Cesare fell in that forgotten field in Spain, when Alexander lay decomposing in the Vatican, a power vacuum was created, and nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. The man who filled it was the Borgias' most implacable, most patient, and most brilliant enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who would take the papal name Julius II. For a decade, della Rovere had been the shadow opposition. He had fled from Alexander's Rome, conspired with the King of France to have him deposed, and waited, seething for his moment. He was everything Alexander was not, a stern, unsmiling man of action, a soldier in cardinal's robes who was far more comfortable on a horse, directing cannon fire, than he was presiding over a synod. His hatred for the Borgias was not just political, it was deeply, profoundly personal. He saw them as foreign interlopers, Spanish upstarts who had stolen the papacy and run amok with its power, treating the Holy See as their personal piggy bank and the Papal States as their family's private kingdom. And now, with them gone, he had his chance not just to rule, but to revise, to edit history itself. Julius II's first and perhaps most symbolic act upon becoming pope was to refuse to live in the Borgia apartments. He declared that he would not be tormented by the memory of the man he called a Jew, an apostate, and a Marano. Using the ugliest slurs of the era, he sealed the doors to those lavishly decorated rooms with their vibrant Penturiquary frescoes depicting the Borgias in the guise of saints and holy figures. He chose to live in the rooms above, as if to physically place himself on a higher moral plane. By locking those doors, he was sending a message to all of Rome and to all of history. The Borgia era is over, and it is to be forgotten, walled up, erased. This was an ancient Roman practice called damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. It was a state-sanctioned attempt to scrub a person from history. Statues were torn down, names were chiseled off inscriptions, and coins were melted down. Julius, a man steeped in the classical world, understood its power. He began a quiet but thorough campaign to dismantle the Borgia legacy. Borgia loyalists were pushed out of the Curia, their lands were seized and redistributed, and their Spanish relatives and allies found the climate in Rome had become decidedly chilly. Forget arguments over the thermostat. The main goal now for any Borgia associate was simply not to wake up in a prison cell or at the bottom of the Tiber. But Julius was a savvy politician. He knew that you couldn't just create a void. You had to fill it with something else. To truly destroy the Borgia name, he needed to replace the memory of their power with a new narrative, a story of their unique and monstrous depravity. He needed to paint them not just as political rivals who had lost, but as a moral plague that had been cleansed from the holy city. And for that, he needed scribes, he needed historians, he needed men with ink-stained fingers and a talent for turning rumour into established fact. History, you see, is rarely an objective account of what happened. It is a story, and that story is almost always written by the winners, the people who now had the ear of the Pope, the people whose patronage depended on staying in his good graces, were all too happy to provide the narrative he desired. The age of the printing press was dawning, and for the first time, a story, a legend could be disseminated with frightening speed and permanence. Chief among these storytellers was a man named Francesco Guicciardini, a Florentine diplomat and historian. Guicciardini wrote his History of Italy decades after the Borgias were gone, but his work became the foundational text for their black legend. To say he wasn't a fan would be a rather spectacular understatement. He despised them. He saw them as the ultimate cause of Italy's woes, the ambitious foreigners whose greed had invited French and Spanish armies to trample over the Italian peninsula. He compiled every rumour, every whisper, every piece of salacious gossip, and presented it as sober historical analysis. In Guicciardini's hands, Alexander VI was not just a corrupt pope, he was the Antichrist in human form. Guicciardini describes him with a literary flourish that is both compelling and utterly biased. He writes of Alexander's insatiable greed, immoderate ambition, and more than barbarous cruelty. He speaks of a man who sold holy offices without distinction, whose nights were filled with monstrous debaucheries, and whose heart was a pit of poisonous perfidy. It's breathtaking prose, but it's the prose of a prosecutor, not a historian. He takes the known facts that Alexander had children, that he used church funds for his family, and coats them in a thick layer of infernal motive and supernatural evil. Every death of a wealthy cardinal is automatically a poisoning, every political maneuver a sign of diabolical cunning. Guicciardini created the Borgia monster that we still recognize today. Then there was the papal master of ceremonies, Johannes Burchard. His diary is one of our most important primary sources for the Borgia papacy, but it's a tricky one. Think of Burchard as the ultimate court insider, a man whose job was to observe and record every detail of every ceremony. He was meticulous. He was also a prodigious gossip. His diary is a fascinating and often frustrating mix of official procedure and scandalous rumour. He reports what he sees, but he also reports what he hears. It is from Burchard that we get the story of the infamous Banquet of the Chestnuts, an event that has come to define the supposed depravity of the Borgia court. According to Burchard's diary, in October of 1501, Cesare Borgia hosted a dinner party in his Vatican apartments. After the meal, the story goes, the candelabras were removed from the tables and placed on the floor, and 50 courtesans were brought in. Chestnuts were scattered among the candles, and the courtesans and dinner guests, on their hands and knees, crawled among the flames to pick them up. Burchard's account ends with the mention of prizes being given for those who could perform with the courtesans the most times. It's an incredible story. It's so decadent, so perfectly scandalous, that it almost feels like a scene from a movie. And that's the problem. Was Burchard reporting a real event, or was he writing down a piece of wild gossip that was circulating around Rome? A story so outrageous he felt compelled to record it. It's almost impossible to know. Historians still debate it, but it doesn't really matter whether it happened precisely as he described. What matters is that the story was recorded, and later writers like Guicciardini picked it up and ran with it. It became proof positive of the Borgias' hedonism, the ultimate example of their contempt for the sanctity of the Vatican. It was just too good a story to fact-check. But not every contemporary voice was a hostile one. There is one crucial and very different perspective that we have to consider, and it comes from a man who was perhaps the most brilliant political mind of the age, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat who had a front-row seat to Cesare Borgia's campaigns in the Romagna. He met Cesare several times and observed him with a kind of cold, professional fascination. Machiavelli was not interested in morality. He wasn't bothered by questions of good and evil. He was interested in one thing and one thing only: power. How to get it, how to keep it, and how to use it effectively. And in Cesare Borgia, he saw the ultimate case study. When Machiavelli wrote his slim, infamous book, The Prince, he used Cesare as the primary model for his ideal ruler. This wasn't because he thought Cesare was a nice guy. It was because he saw Cesare as brutally, terrifyingly effective. Machiavelli noted how Cesare could be charming and generous one moment, and then ruthlessly execute his own lieutenants the next, as he did at Sinigalia. A modern person would call this psychopathic. Machiavelli called it good politics. He admired Cesare's ability to use cruelty well, to strike with such speed and ferocity that his enemies were too paralyzed by fear to resist. He saw Cesare's consolidation of the Romagna not as an act of naked aggression, but as a masterclass in state-building, taming a lawless region and bringing it order and stability, even if it was through fear and violence. Machiavelli gives us a Borgia stripped of all the supernatural evil. He doesn't care about the rumors of poison or incest. He sees a man who understood the brutal realities of his time, a man who knew that in the violent game of Italian politics, you couldn't be hampered by sentiment or Christian morality if you wanted to win. For Machiavelli, Cesare's failure wasn't a moral one, it was a strategic one. He was brought down not by divine justice, but by what Machiavelli calls fortuna, fortune, or luck. He made the mistake of trusting the wrong man, Julius II, and he had the bad luck of falling desperately ill at the exact moment his father died. His downfall was a matter of chance, and a single political miscalculation, not a sign of God's wrath. So we have these two competing narratives, born from the same era. Guicciardini's Borgias, monstrous, diabolical sinners who defied God and nature, and Machiavelli's Borgia, the cold, brilliant, and ultimately unlucky practitioner of power politics. The Black Legend, of course, chose to remember Guicciardini's version. It was simply a better story. Let's dissect the greatest hits of that story, the three accusations that form the core of the Black Legend: incest, poison, and simony. First, incest. The rumour that Alexander VI was sleeping with his own daughter Lucrezia, and that she in turn was sleeping with her brother Cesare, is perhaps the most enduring and hideous of all the Borgia myths. It's the accusation that truly turns them from mere criminals into monsters. The source of this rumour was almost certainly Lucrezia's first husband, Giovanni Sforza. When the Pope annulled their marriage on the grounds of non-consummation, a deeply humiliating public declaration of Sforza's impotence, Sforza, in a rage, retaliated by telling anyone who would listen that the Pope only wanted Lucrezia back so he could have her for himself. It was the perfect slander. In an age obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy, an accusation of incest was the ultimate pollutant. It suggested a family so corrupt, so turned in on itself, that it was outside the bounds of nature and God. It was a lie that was impossible to disprove and delicious to repeat. The Borgia's enemies seized on it gleefully. It was repeated in the dispatches of ambassadors and whispered in the courts of Europe, but for all its fame, there is not a single shred of credible, corroborating evidence that it ever happened. It was a political smear, pure and simple, a brutally effective one, designed to dehumanize the family and justify any action taken against them. Lucrezia, who by all accounts ended her life as a respected and pious Duchess of Ferrara, was forever stained by a lie told by an ex-husband with a bruised ego. Next, poison. The legend of Cantarella, the secret Borgia poison, is a cornerstone of their myth, a tasteless, odorless white powder, supposedly a variation of arsenic, that could be slipped into wine, killing its victims slowly over days or weeks. Mimicking the symptoms of a fever, Cesare was said to carry it in a special ring. It's a wonderfully sinister idea. It conjures up images of intimate dinners, where a single gesture could seal a man's fate. It makes the Borgias seem like masters of some dark alchemical art. The reality, as is often the case, is probably a lot more mundane. Political assassination was, without a doubt, a common tool in Renaissance Italy. People were stabbed, strangled, and yes, poisoned. Arsenic was a popular choice, but the idea of a secret, undetectable Borgia family recipe is almost certainly a myth. The truth is, people died suddenly and inexplicably all the time in the 16th century. Medicine was primitive. Diseases we now understand, malaria, typhus, dysentery, appendicitis, were mysterious and deadly killers. A wealthy cardinal with a gout-ridden lifestyle, who suddenly develops a fever, stomach cramps and dies a few days later, could very well have been poisoned, or he could have had a ruptured appendix, or food poisoning from a bad oyster. But if you are the Borgias, and you happen to inherit that cardinal's wealth after his death, which story is more likely to spread, the boring medical explanation, or the thrilling tale of a secret poison? The legend of Cantarella was a way of explaining the Borgias' incredible success and the convenient deaths of their opponents. It was easier to believe they had a supernatural weapon than to accept they were simply that politically astute and that lucky. The greatest irony, of course, is that the one death that truly mattered, Alexander VI, was almost certainly caused not by poison but by a mosquito. He and Cesare both contracted a violent fever, what was almost certainly a severe strain of Roman malaria. The masters of poison were brought down by the most common pest in the city. Finally, we have simony and corruption. This is the one accusation that is, without question, completely true. Rodrigo Borgia almost certainly bought the papacy in the conclave of 1492. He bribed, he promised, he cajoled, and he won. Once pope, he sold church offices, created new cardinalships to be sold to the highest bidder, and used the church's vast wealth to fund his family's political ambitions. He was corrupt, but here is the crucial, and I mean absolutely crucial, piece of context that the black legend always conveniently omits. In this, he was not unique at all. Complaining about simony and corruption in the late 15th century papacy is like complaining that water is wet. It was the system. The entire institution was soaked in money, nepotism and power politics. Popes had been having children for centuries. Cardinals behaved like secular princes because that's what they were. The man who succeeded Alexander Julius II won his own election through bribery. The man before him, Innocent VIII, was so blatant about his illegitimate children that he was the first pope to acknowledge them publicly, earning him the nickname the Father. The Borgias' sin was not that they were corrupt, it was that they were better at being corrupt than almost anyone else. They were outsiders, Catalans in a sea of Italians, and they played the game with a shocking efficiency and a terrifying ambition that the old established Roman families like the Orsini and the Colonna found deeply unsettling. Those families had treated the papacy as their own private club for generations, fighting over it like dogs over a bone. The Borgias arrived and for a brief, brilliant decade made it entirely their own. Their enemies hated them, not because they broke the rules, but because they, as foreigners, had mastered the game and were winning. So, were the Borgias truly the monstrous aberration that the black legend paints them to be, or were they simply the ultimate product of their time? The answer, like most things in history, is somewhere in the murky middle. They were not saints. Alexander VI was a secular ruler who happened to wear the papal tiara, a man of enormous appetites and a deep abiding love for his children and their advancement. Cesare Borgia was a brilliant general and a ruthless politician, a man who, as Machiavelli observed, did not let conscience stand in the way of his objectives. They were ambitious, they were nepotistic, and they were often brutal. But were they uniquely so? Were they really worse than the Sforza family of Milan who invited the French army into Italy, plunging the peninsula into half a century of warfare? Were they more brutal than the Medici of Florence, who could orchestrate assassinations in the middle of high mass? Were they more warlike than their great enemy, Julius II, the warrior pope, who personally led his armies into battle to reconquer the Papal States, the very lands Cesare had first consolidated? Probably not. The difference was that the Borgias lost, and the winners, led by Julius II, got to write the history. They took the Borgias' real sins, their corruption, their nepotism, their violence, and magnified them, adding the fantastical elements of incest and secret poisons to create a narrative of absolute evil. It was a politically necessary fiction. By painting the Borgia papacy as a singular dark stain on the history of the Church, Julius II could present his own reign as a restoration, a cleansing, a return to holiness, even as he engaged in much of the same power politics and warfare. And once created, the legend took on a life of its own. It was just too compelling to fade away. In the 19th century, writers like Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas, who were novelists and not historians, discovered the story and fell in love with its dramatic potential. They stripped away the political complexities and the historical context and presented the Borgias as the ultimate Gothic villains. Lucrezia became a femme fatale, a beautiful monster with a poisoned ring, Cesare became a brooding, amoral anti-hero. Alexander became a leering puppet master of sin. They were perfect for the Romantic era's obsession with passion, crime, and melodrama. And that is largely how they have come down to us today, in movies and television shows. They have become a brand. The name Borgia is a trademark for Renaissance scandal. We are fascinated by them, not because we are interested in the intricacies of papal politics in the 1490s, but because they represent a fantasy of ultimate power, of a life lived without rules, without limits, and without conscience. They are the dark reflection of the Renaissance's brilliance, the shadow to its light. The true legacy of the Borgias is therefore a dual one. There is the historical reality, a fiercely ambitious Spanish family who for a short time mastered the brutal game of Italian politics and came closer than anyone to carving out a hereditary kingdom in the heart of Italy before fortune turned against them. And then there is the legend, a dark fairy tale of poison, incest and ambition, a story crafted by their enemies to ensure that the Borgias would be remembered not for their successes, but for their sins, both real and imagined. The locked doors of the Borgia apartments in the Vatican were eventually reopened. Centuries later, the frescoes by Pinturicchio are still there, vibrant and beautiful. You can see the face of a serene blonde Madonna that is said to be the portrait of Lucrezia. You can see the Pope, Alexander VI, kneeling in prayer, looking for all the world like a pious leader of Christendom. It's a strange feeling to stand in those rooms. They are quiet now. The whispers and the plotting are long gone. All that remains is the art and the ghosts and the powerful, enduring echo of a story. A story of a family who flew so close to the sun that they were not just burned, but their very ashes were gathered up and remade into a cautionary tale, a black legend that has entertained and horrified us ever since. And as we sit here now in the quiet of our own rooms, it is a potent reminder that the history we think we know is often just the best story that survived, the one told with the most passion, the most conviction, and often with the most venom. The truth is usually quieter, more complicated, and much harder to find in the dark.